It began as a name on a map and ended as a wound carved into history. Stalingrad was not chosen by accident. It carried symbolism, industry, and pride. It sat along the Volga like a spine, linking the Soviet interior to the front lines of survival. By the summer of 1942, the war in the East had already consumed millions, yet both sides believed the decisive moment still lay ahead. For Germany, Stalingrad promised victory through capture, a blow to morale, a severing of supply, a city bearing the name of the enemy's leader taken by force. For the Soviet Union, it became something far more absolute. This city would not be surrendered. The German advance toward Stalingrad began with confidence rebuilt after earlier setbacks. Armies surged south through open steppe, under brutal heat, dust-coated uniforms, engines overheated. The Luftwaffe bombed the city into rubble before most of the fighting even began, believing destruction would soften resistance. Instead, it created a fortress. Factories collapsed into defensive positions. Apartment blocks became strong points. Stairwells, basements, and sewers turned into battlefields. Stalingrad ceased to be a city. It became terrain twisted, shattered, and lethal. What followed was not maneuver warfare. It was proximity. Men fought across rooms measured in meters. Positions changed hands multiple times a day. Snipers hunted from ruins that no longer resembled buildings. The Germans called it Rattenkrieg, Rat War, because it felt subterranean, claustrophobic, and endless. Tanks were nearly useless. Artillery destroyed what little cover remained. Infantry advanced knowing that survival might depend on holding a single wall or stairwell through the night. The Volga itself became a lifeline and a grave. Under constant fire, Soviet reinforcements crossed at night in small boats. Many never made it across. Those who did often arrived with minimal training, sometimes without rifles, told simply where to go and when to fight. Retreat was not an option. The river was behind them, the enemy in front. Winter arrived early. Cold settled into bones already weakened by hunger and exhaustion. Ammunition froze, weapons jammed. Wounded men lay where they fell, because reaching them meant death. Entire divisions were consumed not in days, but in hours. And still, the fighting continued. Every meter of ground was contested. Every gain paid for in blood. Every order carried weight no one could escape. Then, while the city burned itself hollow, something else began to move. Far beyond the ruins, Soviet forces massed silently. Armies assembled in the cold. Supplies were hidden. Plans were drawn not to defend the city, but to encircle the attackers who believed they were winning. When the counteroffensive came, it came like a door slamming shut. German flanks collapsed. Supply lines were cut. An entire army found itself surrounded. The hunters became the trapped. Inside the pocket, reality set in slowly, then all at once. Food ran out. Ammunition dwindled. Evacuation by air failed. The cold deepened. Orders from above demanded resistance without offering relief. Men froze, starved, and waited for something that would never arrive. The fighting did not end with a dramatic final charge. It ended with silence, surrender, and bodies frozen where they fell. Stalingrad was more than a defeat. It was a fracture. It shattered the myth of German invincibility. It marked the point where the war in the East turned permanently. It proved that endurance, sacrifice, and planning could overcome speed and ideology. The cost was beyond comprehension. An entire city destroyed. Hundreds of thousands dead or captured. Families erased. Lives broken long after the guns fell silent. The Battle of Stalingrad matters because it shows what total war truly is. Not glory. Not triumph. But survival pushed beyond human limits. It stands as a reminder of how far nations will go and how much they will lose when surrender becomes unthinkable. Tonight, we return to those ruins. To the frozen streets and shattered factories. To the place where a world war changed direction and never looked back. To Stalingrad, where history was decided not in days, but in suffering. And before we continue, I want to speak to you honestly. If you're still here listening carefully, quietly, if these long, immersive journeys into history give you perspective, calm, or a place to rest your thoughts at the end of the day, then I hope you'll consider subscribing. I'm a small creator, building this channel one story at a time, without rushing, without sensationalism, and with deep respect for the people who live these moments. When you subscribe, you're not just supporting a channel, you're helping keep this kind of thoughtful, slow storytelling alive. If this space means something to you, if it gives you focus, comfort, or understanding, then stay with me. Settle in. This is the complete history of the Battle of Stalingrad. June 16th, 1942. A Tuesday morning in Stalingrad. 13-year-old Olga Kovalenko sits on the stone steps of her apartment building on Pushkin Street, watching her younger brother chase pigeons across the square. The air smells of bread from the bakery below and machine oil from the Dzержinski tractor factory, where her father works the morning shift. She doesn't know that in 68 days, this street will cease to exist. She doesn't know that the pigeons will be gone, eaten by starving soldiers. She doesn't know that her apartment building will become a fortress where men will kill each other room by room, floor by floor, for 5 consecutive weeks. On this June morning, Stalingrad is simply home to 600,000 people who believe the war, raging 1,500 miles to the west, will never reach them. They are catastrophically wrong. The city, stretching along the western bank of the Volga River, had not always carried Stalin's name. For centuries, it was Tsaritsyn, a fortress town where the Tsaritsa River met the Great Volga, the artery connecting Russia's industrial heartland to the Caspian Sea and the oil-rich Caucasus beyond. During the Russian Civil War, a Bolshevik commander named Joseph Stalin defended the city against White Russian forces, transforming a minor skirmish into the founding myth of his revolutionary credentials. In April 1925, the city was renamed in his honor during a ceremony where Stalin himself stood on a platform draped in red banners, watching as the old name was erased from history. What had been Tsaritsyn became Stalingrad, the city of Stalin, and with that renaming came both destiny and doom. By the 1930s, Stalin had transformed his namesake city into one of the Soviet Union's most important industrial centers, a showcase of communist achievement where massive factories churned out tractors, guns, and the lifeblood of Soviet military power. The transformation was staggering in its scope and brutality. The Dzержinski tractor factory covered nearly 2 square miles, employing 40,000 workers who lived in massive apartment complexes built specifically to house them. The Red October steel plant produced the hardened armor plate for Soviet tanks, its furnaces burning day and night, visible as an orange glow across the Volga. The Barricady gun factory manufactured artillery pieces by the hundreds, the sound of heavy machinery creating a constant industrial symphony that defined the city's rhythm. By 1942, these 3 complexes alone accounted for nearly 40% of the Soviet Union's tank production and 25% of its artillery. But these factories were more than economic assets. They were symbols of Soviet industrial might, proof that communism could transform Russia from an agrarian backwater into a modern military power. Stalin visited in 1937, touring the factory floors, shaking hands with workers whose names appeared in Pravda the next day as heroes of socialist labor. The city itself was strange in its geography, a consequence of the Volga's path and Russian expansion. Stalingrad stretched for 30 miles along the river's western bank, but extended only 2 to 3 miles inland before the steppe began. It was a ribbon of humanity clinging to the water, connected to the Soviet rear only by ferries and barges crossing the Volga's half-mile width. The city center clustered around several key points: the Mamayev Kurgan, a mammoth hill rising 102 meters above the river, offering views across the entire city, the central landing stages where ferries docked, the railway station connecting Stalingrad to Moscow, and the Don River crosslands to the west. Neighborhoods had names that would soon become synonymous with death: the Barricady district in the north, the Red October district surrounding the steel plant, the central city with its department stores and administrative buildings, the southern suburbs near the grain elevators. Most buildings were wooden, constructed quickly during the 1920s and 30s to house the influx of workers. Only the factories themselves, the railway station, a few apartment blocks, and administrative buildings were stone or concrete. This would matter enormously when the fire came. The people of Stalingrad in June 1942 lived in a strange twilight between peace and war. They knew Germany had invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, that the Wehrmacht had reached the outskirts of Moscow before being pushed back. They knew Leningrad was under siege, that millions of Soviet soldiers had been killed or captured. But Stalingrad felt distant from all that, protected by geography and the vastness of Russian space. Fathers and sons had been conscripted, sent to the front, but the front was somewhere else, someone else's problem. Women worked the factory floors now, producing the tanks and guns that would defeat fascism. Children attended school, played in the streets, swam in the Volga during the brutal summer heat. Political officers gave speeches about Stalin's genius and inevitable Soviet victory, but even they seemed to believe the war would be decided elsewhere. On June 22nd, the first anniversary of the German invasion, there was a memorial service at the Mamayev Kurgan for the war dead. No one imagined that within 3 months, the hill itself would become the deadliest piece of ground on Earth. The strategic importance of Stalingrad was obvious to anyone who studied a map, but in June 1942, Soviet command believed the city was not under immediate threat. The German summer offensive, Case Blue, had begun on June 28th, but intelligence suggested the Wehrmacht was driving toward the Caucasus oil fields, not Stalingrad. The Volga River was the lifeline carrying 90% of the Caucasus oil north to Soviet industry. If Germany cut that artery, the Soviet war machine would starve. But cutting the artery didn't necessarily require taking Stalingrad. German aircraft and artillery could interdict river traffic from positions nearby. The city's industrial capacity was valuable, but not irreplaceable. The Urals factories beyond the Volga produced more. What made Stalingrad truly important was invisible on military maps. It bore Stalin's name. Losing Tsaritsyn would have been a military setback. Losing Stalingrad would be a psychological catastrophe, a propaganda gift to Hitler, and a humiliation to Stalin personally. Both dictators understood this perfectly, though neither would admit how much their egos would shape the battle's course. August 23, 1942, 4:30 in the afternoon. Olga Kovalenko is helping her mother hang laundry in their courtyard when she hears a sound like distant thunder. Within seconds, the thunder becomes a roar that drowns out all thought. She looks up and sees them, hundreds of aircraft, black crosses visible on their wings, flying in perfect formation toward the city center. The Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet, 600 bombers and fighters, has come to destroy Stalingrad in a single afternoon. The first bombs hit the city center at 6 o'clock precisely, and within minutes, the wooden residential districts are engulfed in flames. The firestorm creates its own weather, winds sucking oxygen toward the inferno, temperatures reaching 800 degrees Celsius. Olga and her mother run toward the Volga with thousands of others, clutching whatever possessions they could grab. Behind them, their apartment building catches fire, the wooden structure becoming a torch. The pigeons are long gone. By midnight, 40,000 civilians are dead, and the city of Stalin is burning like a vision of hell. The next morning, Soviet commander Andrei Yeremenko arrived at a command post on the Volga's eastern bank and surveyed the destruction through binoculars. Smoke columns rose thousands of feet into the sky, visible for 50 miles in every direction. The wooden districts were simply gone, reduced to ash and brick chimneys standing like tombstones. The industrial district still stood, the massive factory buildings constructed of concrete and steel, but they were surrounded by ruins. Yeremenko understood immediately what this meant. There would be no battle for Stalingrad as a functioning city. The battle would be for the ruins, for the symbolic value of holding ground that bore Stalin's name, for the industrial plants that could still produce weapons even while fighting raged around them. He sent a cable to Moscow. The city has suffered catastrophic damage, civilian evacuation proceeding with heavy losses. Luftwaffe maintains air superiority. Defending Stalingrad will require forces currently unavailable. The response came within hours, not from the military command, but from Stalin personally. 7 words that would doom hundreds of thousands of men. Stalingrad must not fall. No retreat. The civilian population that survived the August 23rd raid faced an impossible choice. The Soviet government had not organized evacuation before the bombing, believing it would damage morale and suggest defeat was possible. Now, with the city burning and German tanks approaching from the west. Evacuating 600,000 people across the Volga under Luftwaffe attack was a nightmare scenario. Ferries and barges ran constantly, overloaded with families clutching suitcases and bundles. German aircraft strafed the boats, machine gun bullets walking across the water, tearing through wooden hulls. Survivors remembered the river turning red, bodies floating downstream, children's screams mixing with the scream of diving Stukas. By early September, perhaps 400,000 civilians had crossed to the eastern bank. That left 200,000 trapped in the city, and most of those would die in the coming months, crushed in collapsing buildings, killed by shell fire, starving in cellars. Later, after the battle, Soviet authorities claimed only 10,000 to 15,000 civilians remained in Stalingrad by November. The rest had either escaped or been killed. The city of Stalin had become a graveyard. On September 10, 1942, German reconnaissance units reached the Volga north of Stalingrad, cutting the city off from land connection to the Soviet rear. Within days, forward elements of the German Sixth Army were probing Stalingrad's northern suburbs. The battle everyone had feared but few had prepared for was beginning. Stalin issued orders that reflected both military necessity and personal obsession. Order 247 established that any commander who retreated without orders would be executed. Order 248 created blocking detachments of NKVD troops positioned behind Soviet lines, authorized to shoot any soldier who fled. And most famously, Order 227, issued back in July but now taking on new meaning. Not one step back. The Soviet soldiers moving into Stalingrad's ruins understood they were entering a trap. The Volga at their backs meant no retreat was possible. The Germans before them meant attack was suicidal. All that remained was to hold, to die in place, to make every ruined building a fortress and every room a tomb. The city that bore Stalin's name would be defended with a fanaticism that matched his own merciless will. What happened next would change the course of the Second World War. April 5, 1942. The Wolf's Lair, Hitler's military headquarters in Rastenburg, East Prussia. Adolf Hitler stands over a massive map table, his fingers tracing lines across southern Russia with the confidence of a man who believes himself destiny's instrument. General Franz Halder, chief of the Army General Staff, watches in silence as the Führer circles the Caucasus Mountains with a red pencil, then draws a line north to the Volga River at Stalingrad. Here, Hitler says, tapping the map where the city sits on the river's western bank. The city that bears Stalin's name. We will take it, and in taking it, we will break Soviet morale and cut their oil supply in one stroke. Halder does not point out that these are two separate objectives requiring different strategies. He does not mention that the Wehrmacht's summer offensive is splitting forces between the Caucasus oil fields and the Volga River, violating every principle of concentration of force. Hitler has made his decision, and Halder has learned that questioning the Führer's strategic vision leads nowhere but dismissal. Führer Directive 41 is drafted that morning, ordering the German summer offensive, Case Blue, to achieve two simultaneous objectives that are 600 miles apart. The strategic situation facing Germany in spring 1942 was both promising and desperate. The Wehrmacht had survived the winter outside Moscow, the first time in modern history that Hitler's armies had failed to achieve their objectives. Soviet counteroffensives had driven German forces back from the capital, shattering the myth of invincibility. But the spring thaw had frozen operations, and now Hitler planned to regain initiative with a massive offensive in the south. The objective made perfect strategic sense. The Caucasus oil fields supplied 80% of Soviet petroleum. Capture those fields, and the Red Army's tanks would run dry within months. Cut the Volga River at Stalingrad, and Soviet oil barges couldn't transport fuel north to Moscow. Control the Don and Volga rivers, and Germany would have a defensible line from Voronezh to the Caspian Sea. The plan was brilliant in conception. The execution would prove catastrophic because Hitler could not choose between objectives. General Friedrich Paulus received command of the Sixth Army in January 1942. A staff officer promoted to field command at age 51. Tall, meticulous, and intellectually brilliant, Paulus was the perfect officer for planning operations at Army High Command. Whether he possessed the ruthlessness and improvisational skill for field command remained uncertain. His fellow generals noted his hesitancy, his tendency to refer decisions upward to higher command, his need for approval, but Hitler valued loyalty over initiative, and Paulus was nothing if not loyal. His Sixth Army was the strongest formation in the Wehrmacht, 330,000 men organized into 20 divisions, supported by 500 tanks, 7,000 artillery pieces, and the Luftwaffe's 4th Air Fleet with its 600 aircraft. As Case Blue commenced on June 28, 1942, the Sixth Army surged across the Don River and into the steppe, crushing Soviet resistance, capturing thousands of prisoners. By mid-July, forward units had advanced 250 miles, and Paulus believed Stalingrad would fall within weeks. But on July 30th, Hitler issued an order that would doom Case Blue and ultimately the Sixth Army itself. Directive No. 45 split Army Group South into two separate army groups. Army Group A would drive south into the Caucasus, and Army Group B would turn east towards Stalingrad. More critically, the 4th Panzer Army, which had been supporting Paulus's drive towards Stalingrad, was diverted south to support the Caucasus operation. The 6th Army would take Stalingrad without its armored support, its southern flank exposed, its advance slowing as supply lines stretched across the steppe. German generals protested. Halder argued that dividing forces violated basic military doctrine. General Hermann Hoth, commanding 4th Panzer Army, pointed out that his tanks were within striking distance of Stalingrad, and diverting them would cost weeks. Hitler dismissed all objections. He wanted the Caucasus oil fields, and he wanted Stalingrad, and he believed German superiority could achieve both simultaneously. It was the first of many decisions where Hitler's ego overruled military logic. August 19, 1942. German tanks of the 14th Panzer Corps reached the Volga River north of Stalingrad, a tremendous achievement after 2 months of continuous advance. Paulus stood in his command vehicle, binoculars raised, watching the river glitter in the afternoon sun. 22 miles north to south lay Stalingrad, visible as a smudge of smoke on the southern horizon. His men were exhausted, his tanks low on fuel, his supply trucks strung out across 250 miles of steppe. But the objective was in sight, and Paulus believed momentum would carry his army into the city within days. He composed a letter to his wife Elena that evening. "We are so close. I can see the Volga. The men know victory is within our grasp. Perhaps in 2 weeks, this will all be over and I can come home." The letter reached Elena in Dresden 3 weeks later. By then, Paulus had discovered that seeing the Volga and crossing it were entirely different propositions. By then, the Sixth Army had entered Stalingrad's northern suburbs and learned that urban warfare was unlike anything they had experienced in France, Poland, or the open steppe. The German plan for taking Stalingrad was straightforward. The 14th Panzer Corps would attack from the north, driving along the Volga's western bank, crushing Soviet defenders against the river. The 51st Corps would attack the city center. The 4th Panzer Army, having been diverted back from the Caucasus, would strike from the south. Soviet forces would be trapped and destroyed. Simple, direct, overwhelming force applied simultaneously from 3 directions. The plan assumed Soviet defenders would react as they had throughout Case Blue: retreat, surrender, collapse. The plan assumed Stalingrad was a city that could be taken like any other, with armor and artillery and Luftwaffe support. What the plan failed to account for was the psychology of defending a city bearing Stalin's name. It failed to account for the Volga at the defenders' backs, eliminating retreat as an option. Most critically, it failed to account for how rubble and ruins neutralize armor and aircraft, transforming warfare into something primitive and personal, where victory is measured in rooms captured and defeat measured in bodies stacked in cellars. August 23rd's firebombing had destroyed Stalingrad as a functioning city, but had inadvertently created perfect defensive terrain. The wooden residential districts were gone, replaced by brick rubble and standing walls that provided excellent firing positions. Multi-story buildings, their wooden floors burned away, became vertical battlefields where defenders on upper floors could fire down at attackers. The massive factory complexes, built with concrete and steel to Soviet industrial specifications, were virtually indestructible fortresses. Basements and sewers created an underground network, allowing defenders to move unseen, to appear behind German lines, to attack and fade away. As German forces pushed into Stalingrad's northern suburbs in late August, they discovered that every block required a battle, every building a small war. Tanks, the mobile striking force that had conquered Poland in weeks and France in 6 weeks, found themselves immobilized in rubble-choked streets, vulnerable to Soviet soldiers with anti-tank rifles and Molotov cocktails attacking from cellars and ruins. The battle Paulus expected to win in days was mutating into something else entirely. Hitler's obsession with Stalingrad deepened as August became September. Daily cables from the Führer's headquarters demanded progress reports, questioned why the city had not yet fallen, implied that German soldiers were not fighting with sufficient determination. On September 4th, Hitler issued a supplementary order. Stalingrad must be taken and held. The city bearing Stalin's name cannot remain in Soviet hands. The Volga must be secured. Paulus understood the political meaning behind the order. Taking Stalingrad was no longer purely military, it was ideological warfare, a propaganda battle between two totalitarian dictators. But political objectives do not make urban assault any easier. The Sixth Army was fighting street by street, taking catastrophic casualties for minimal gains. Soviet reinforcements crossed the Volga nightly, fed into the battle as quickly as German forces could kill them. The Luftwaffe still controlled the skies. German artillery still pulverized Soviet positions, but none of it seemed to matter when every ruined building contained Soviet soldiers willing to die rather than retreat. Paulus wrote in his diary, "We are winning by every measure kills, territory gained, enemy forces destroyed. Yet somehow, we are not winning at all." The German supply situation was deteriorating in ways that were not yet critical, but were deeply concerning to logisticians. The Sixth Army required 700 tons of supplies daily: ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies, replacement parts. These supplies traveled by rail from Germany to the Don River crossings, then by truck across the steppe to Stalingrad. A single railway line stretched 1,200 miles from Germany to the front, vulnerable to partisan attack and Soviet air raids. Fuel consumption for the truck convoys meant that delivering 1 ton of fuel to Stalingrad required burning half a ton just moving it across the steppe. Food was not yet a problem, as the fertile steppe provided grain and livestock for requisition, but ammunition consumption was staggering. Urban warfare meant grenade use increased tenfold, machine gun ammunition expenditure quadrupled, and artillery batteries fired constantly to suppress Soviet positions. By early September, the Sixth Army was consuming 800 tons daily, but receiving only 600 tons. The 100-ton daily deficit was being made up by drawing down stockpiles built during the advance. Those stockpiles would not last forever. September 12, 1942. General Vasily Chuikov arrived at the Volga crossing point to assume command of the Soviet 62nd Army, now responsible for defending Stalingrad. He crossed in darkness, German artillery illuminating the river with shell fire, boats and barges burning. On the western bank, he was driven through ruins to a command bunker dug into the Volga cliff face. His predecessor briefed him on the situation. The German Sixth Army controlled 70% of Stalingrad. Soviet forces were compressed into 3 shrinking pockets along the river. Casualties were catastrophic. Ammunition was running low. Chuikov asked the crucial question, "Can we hold?" The answer was uncertain. Chuikov issued his first orders: fight for every building, make the Germans pay for every room, stay so close to German lines that their aircraft and artillery cannot fire without hitting their own men. "We will defend this city or die here," he told his officers. "There is no land for us beyond the Volga." It was not propaganda. Chuikov understood that Stalin's Order 227 meant exactly what it said. Not one step back. Across the ruined city, in cellars and bunkers and behind rubble walls, 54,000 Soviet soldiers prepared to fight 330,000 Germans. The mathematics suggested annihilation. But mathematics do not account for desperation, or for what men become when given no choice but to fight or die. July 28, 1942, 3:15 in the afternoon. Joseph Stalin sits alone in his Kremlin office, cigarette smoke layering the air. Maps of southern Russia spread across his desk, showing red arrows penetrating deeper into Soviet territory each day. The German summer offensive has torn through Soviet defenses. Rostov has fallen. Voronezh teeters on the edge. Army Group South drives toward the Caucasus oil fields that fuel the Soviet war machine. Stalin reads the latest casualty reports. 200,000 men lost in a single week. Entire armies disintegrating, soldiers fleeing east in panic, abandoning equipment and positions. The Red Army is collapsing. Stalin knows that collapse must stop, regardless of cost. He summons General Alexander Paskrebyshev, his personal secretary, and begins dictating no preamble, no justification, just orders issued in a flat, emotionless voice. Order number 227. Not one step back without order from higher command. Panic-mongers and cowards will be shot on the spot. It is the harshest order issued by any nation during the Second World War. It will save the Soviet Union and kill tens of thousands of Soviet soldiers. The political context of Order 227 is essential to understanding its brutality. The Soviet Union had suffered catastrophic losses since Germany invaded on June 22, 1941. Over 3 million Soviet soldiers were killed or captured in the first 6 months of war. Entire army groups encircled and destroyed. The Wehrmacht had reached the outskirts of Moscow before winter and Soviet counterattacks pushed them back. But spring 1942 brought renewed German offensives, and Stalin feared the Red Army's morale was breaking. Unlike Western democracies, where soldiers fought for abstract concepts like freedom, Soviet soldiers fought under a system that controlled them through terror. The NKVD, the Soviet secret police, already operated within the military, but Order 227 formalized their role as enforcers. The order established that commanders who retreated without authorization would be court-martialed and executed. Officers who failed to maintain discipline would be removed and potentially shot. Most ominously, the order created blocking detachments, specially designated units positioned behind Soviet lines with machine guns, authorized to shoot any soldier who retreated. August 3, 1942. A Soviet rifle regiment assembles in a village 50 miles west of Stalingrad. Exhausted men who have retreated for 6 weeks, who have seen their comrades killed by German tanks and Stuka dive bombers, who believe the war is lost. A political officer stands on an ammunition crate and reads Order 227 aloud. The regiment stands in silence. Some men weep, others stare at the ground. A few nod grimly, understanding that the choice is now binary: fight or be shot for cowardice. After the reading, the political officer points to a machine gun position established behind the regiment's assembly area, manned by NKVD troops in their distinctive green caps. "Those men are your blocking detachment," he says. "Any man who retreats will be shot. Any man who spreads panic will be shot. There is no mercy for cowards." A sergeant raises his hand and asks where they are supposed to retreat to if the Germans break through. The political officer's response is simple. You don't retreat, you die in place, or you advance. Those are your only options. The blocking detachments became one of the most controversial aspects of Soviet military practice. Estimates suggest approximately 13,500 Soviet soldiers were executed by blocking detachments during the Battle of Stalingrad alone, shot by their own comrades for attempting to retreat or for showing insufficient fighting spirit. The executions were often public, conducted in front of assembled troops to demonstrate consequences. But the blocking detachments served another function beyond execution. They caught soldiers fleeing in panic, disarmed them, and sent them back to the front. Records suggest that for every soldier shot, 10 to 20 were stopped, reorganized, and returned to combat. The psychological impact was profound. Soviet soldiers understood that the only direction was forward. Retreat meant death. Surrender to Germans might mean survival, but Order 227 made retreat to Soviet lines equally lethal. The calculus created soldiers with nothing to lose, men who fought with desperate intensity because dying while attacking Germans seemed preferable to dying while fleeing from NKVD bullets. Order 227 also established penal battalions, Strafbats, For soldiers guilty of military crimes ranging from desertion to defeatism to merely being related to someone arrested by NKVD, these penal battalions received the most dangerous assignments: clearing minefields by walking through them, leading frontal assaults against fortified positions, holding indefensible positions while regular units withdrew. The punishment was direct and harsh: redeem your guilt with blood. 422,700 Soviet soldiers served in penal battalions during the war. Their casualty rates were staggering, often 50 to 70% within weeks of assignment. But survivors were pardoned, their records cleared, allowed to return to regular units. The penal battalions were Stalin's tool for turning political unreliables into expendable shock troops. At Stalingrad, entire penal battalions were thrown into breaches in Soviet lines, their bodies literally plugging gaps until reinforcements arrived. German soldiers called them punishment squads and noted they fought with suicidal intensity. Soviet soldiers called them meat, human material to be expended without thought. But Order 227 was not purely terror. Embedded within its harsh language was a psychological shift. The order declared that the Soviet Union's vast territory was not infinite, that retreat could not continue forever. "Not one step back" became a slogan that transcended its brutal enforcement mechanisms. For many Soviet soldiers, the order provided clarity. Months of chaotic retreat, contradictory orders, and collapsing morale suddenly crystallized into a simple directive: hold your position, kill Germans, die if necessary, but die fighting. Political officers used the order to rebuild unit cohesion, arguing that Order 227 meant the Soviet government was committed to victory, that Stalin himself guaranteed no more retreats. Whether soldiers believed this propaganda varied, but the order gave commanders tools to restore discipline and gave soldiers a framework for understanding their role. At Stalingrad, where the Volga River eliminated retreat as a physical possibility, Order 227 aligned military necessity with ideological demand. September 12, 1942. General Vasily Chuikov assumes command of the 62nd Army defending Stalingrad. 54,000 men, 110 tanks, 900 artillery pieces against 330,000 Germans with overwhelming armor and air support. Chuikov's first meeting with his staff officers is tense. He asks directly about morale, about whether his men will stand and fight. A colonel responds honestly: "They will fight because they have no choice. The Volga is behind us, Germans before us, NKVD watching for deserters. We are trapped, and men who are trapped become dangerous." Chuikov nods. He understands that Order 227 has transformed the 62nd Army from a military formation into something else, a cornered animal that will tear its attackers apart even while dying. He issues his tactical doctrine that evening: hug the enemy. Keep Soviet positions within 50 yards of German lines, so close that Luftwaffe bombers cannot strike without hitting their own troops, so close that German artillery becomes useless. Make every German attack a knife fight in rubble and ruins. The human cost of Order 227's enforcement is difficult to calculate precisely. Soviet records from the period are incomplete and often contradictory. NKVD blocking detachments kept records of executions, but not of soldiers stopped and returned to duty. Penal battalion casualties were listed as regular military losses. Post-war Soviet historians, embarrassed by the order's brutality, downplayed its significance or claimed executions were rare. Western historians, during the Cold War, emphasized the order as proof of Soviet barbarity. The truth lies between extremes. Order 227 was brutal, but it was also effective. The Red Army stopped retreating. Casualty rates remained horrific, but they were casualties inflicted while holding positions rather than while fleeing in panic. At Stalingrad, the order created defenders who understood death was certain but believed dying while killing Germans was preferable to execution by their own side. It was a calculation born of desperation, enforced by terror, but ultimately, it worked. The average life expectancy of a Soviet soldier at Stalingrad is often quoted as 24 hours, though some sources suggest numbers as low as 12 hours for infantrymen on the front line. These statistics require context. Soldiers crossing the Volga under German fire had high casualty rates during the crossing itself, 20 to 40% losses before even reaching combat. Once in Stalingrad, casualties varied by location and timing. During major German offensives, entire units could be destroyed in hours. During quieter periods, soldiers might survive days or weeks. The 21st Guards Rifle Division crossed the Volga on September 13th with 10,000 men. 2 days later, 2,500 remained combat effective. The 13th Guards Division, elite troops, suffered similar losses. Replacement soldiers arriving in September had minimal chance of surviving October. Veterans who survived the September battles had learned the particular skills that kept them alive: staying low, moving at night, never silhouetting against the sky, knowing which buildings offered best cover. But even veterans died randomly, killed by shell fire or snipers or collapsing walls. September 15th, 1942, Sergeant Mikhail Panikaka, a Marine in the 62nd Army, crouches in a shell crater as German tanks advance toward his position near the Red October factory. He holds 2 Molotov cocktails, gasoline-filled bottles with cloth fuses. A German tank approaches, its machine gun firing, bullets ricocheting off rubble. Panikaka lights the first bottle's fuse and prepares to throw. A German bullet hits the bottle in his hand, igniting the gasoline, engulfing him in flames. He has seconds to act. He grabs the second bottle, stands, and runs directly at the German tank, a human torch sprinting through the rubble. He smashes the second Molotov cocktail against the tank's engine deck and collapses, dying, as the tank bursts into flames. Soviet soldiers watching from nearby positions see Panikaka's self-sacrifice and counterattack immediately, driving the German infantry back. The story spreads through the 62nd Army within hours, the Marine who became fire itself to destroy an enemy tank. Order 227 created the conditions where such actions seemed not just heroic, but rational. When retreat means execution and surrender means likely death, attacking a tank while burning alive becomes a viable tactical option. This was the psychology Stalin's order had created: soldiers for whom death was certain, but the manner of death remained a choice. September 13th, 1942, 4:45 in the morning. Soviet soldiers of the 62nd Army huddle in basements along Stalingrad's northern perimeter, listening to the silence that precedes German attacks. Then it begins. 2,000 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously, a sound so enormous it transcends hearing and becomes physical pressure, vibrations transmitted through earth and rubble and the air itself. The barrage is precise and methodical, walking across Soviet positions in timed increments, each square meter of ground receiving calculated tons of high explosive and shrapnel. Junior Lieutenant Anatoly Mereshko, sheltering in a factory basement, feels the building shake with each impact, concrete dust raining from the ceiling, cracks spreading across walls. Men pray in corners. Others sit motionless, beyond fear, waiting for either the barrage to end or the ceiling to collapse and crush them. After 90 minutes, the artillery lifts, and German assault infantry advances through the smoke. The September assault has begun, and before it ends, German forces will push to the Volga, splitting Soviet defenders into isolated pockets, but they will not break them. They will discover that winning ground in Stalingrad means nothing when defenders refuse to acknowledge defeat. The strategic objective of the September 13th assault was elegant in its simplicity: crush Soviet defenses before they could consolidate, reach the Volga in multiple locations, divide the 62nd Army into pockets that could be destroyed individually. German intelligence estimated Chuikov commanded 50 to 60,000 effectives. The 6th Army would commit 80,000 troops, 200 tanks, and massive air support to this single assault, overwhelming force applied with surgical precision. The 51st Corps would strike the city center. The 14th Panzer Corps would drive along the Volga's northern bank, capturing the industrial district. The 4th Panzer Army would attack from the south. By nightfall, on September 13th, German planners expected to control Stalingrad's center and force Soviet remnants against the river for final destruction. The plan assumed Soviet defenders would fight as they had elsewhere: hard initial resistance followed by collapse once German armor broke through. What happened instead taught the Wehrmacht that Stalingrad operated under different rules. The first German objective was Mamayev Kurgan, the massive hill rising 102 meters above Stalingrad, dominating the entire battlefield. Whoever controlled the Kurgan's summit could direct artillery fire across the city, observe Soviet movements, coordinate airstrikes. The hill itself was scarred by months of fighting. Vegetation burned away, earth churned by shell fire into a lunar landscape. Soviet defenders had fortified the summit with trenches, bunkers, and machine gun nests. German 71st Infantry Division attacked at 8 o'clock in the morning, infantry advancing behind artillery and tank fire. Soviet defenders emerged from bunkers and fought with intensity that shocked German officers. A company of German infantry reached the summit by mid-morning, raising the swastika flag. Soviet counterattack drove them off by noon. German reinforcements recaptured the summit by 3 in the afternoon. Soviet shock troops stormed the hill at dusk and held it through the night. The battle for Mamayev Kurgan on September 13th changed hands 5 times, each side losing hundreds of men for control of bare earth. By nightfall, Germans held the summit, but Soviet forces clung to the southern slopes. Neither side had won decisively. The Kurgan would change hands dozens more times before the battle ended. September 14th, 4 o'clock in the morning. The Soviet 13th Guards Rifle Division crosses the Volga under German artillery fire. 10,000 soldiers board ferries, barges, and improvised boats at the eastern shore. The crossing is 3/4 of a mile. German guns are pre-sighted on the ferry routes. Shells explode among the boats, creating geysers of water and flame. A barge carrying 300 soldiers takes a direct hit and sinks in seconds, men weighed down by equipment drowning before they can surface. Tracer rounds skip across the water like malevolent fireflies. Soldiers jump from burning boats and swim, abandoning weapons and gear. Guards Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov watches men around him die, hears screams mixing with the scream of incoming shells. His boat makes it across. Of 10,000 men who started the crossing, roughly 8,000 reach Stalingrad's western shore. The 13th Guards Division has lost 20% of its strength before firing a shot. They are immediately thrown into battle to retake the Mamayev Kurgan from German forces. By nightfall, September 15th, the 13th Guards Division has taken the summit and driven Germans back to the northern slopes. The division's combat effective strength, 3,000 men. 2 days in Stalingrad has killed or wounded 70% of an elite formation. The fighting in Stalingrad's apartment blocks and factories developed its own horrific rhythm. German tactics emphasized combined arms, tanks and artillery suppressing Soviet positions, while infantry assaulted. But rubble neutralized armor. Tanks could not traverse streets choked with collapsed buildings. When they attempted to push through, Soviet soldiers with anti-tank rifles, Molotov cocktails, and satchel charges emerged from basements and ruins. The famous Pavlov's house exemplified Soviet defensive doctrine. Sergeant Yakov Pavlov led a reconnaissance squad of 4 men to occupy a 4-story apartment building near 9th January Square on September 15th. The building overlooked a key plaza. Pavlov's squad entered, discovered the building was occupied by civilians sheltering in the basement, cleared German defenders from upper floors. Reinforcements arrived that night. Additional soldiers, machine guns, anti-tank rifles, ammunition. Pavlov's garrison fortified the building, mining approaches, establishing firing positions. The building became a fortress. German forces attacked repeatedly for 58 days and never took it. Soviet propaganda later claimed more Germans died attacking Pavlov's house than died taking Paris. The comparison was absurd, but the building's symbolic importance was real. 4 walls and rubble, defended by 30 men, stopping a German army. September 22nd through 26th, the Grain Elevator Battle. A massive concrete structure on Stalingrad's southern edge, 6 stories tall, walls several feet thick, designed to store thousands of tons of grain. Soviet naval infantry occupied the elevator, approximately 50 Marines. German infantry attacked with overwhelming force. An entire company, over 200 men, supported by tanks and flamethrowers. The battle devolved into nightmare. Marines defending upper floors rained grenades down on German attackers. Germans used flamethrowers to burn defenders out. The fighting moved floor by floor, room by room. Darkness was absolute inside. Electricity long since failed, combat by muzzle flash and screaming, hand-to-hand fighting with knives and shovels. No quarter asked or given. Germans threw grenades into rooms, then stormed in to finish survivors. Marines fought from behind grain sacks, fabric offering no protection but concealing positions. The battle lasted 5 days. When Germans finally captured the elevator on September 26th, they found 18 dead Soviet Marines and no survivors. The entire German company had been committed. Casualties exceeded 100 men. A German lieutenant wrote in his diary, "We fought for 5 days for a single building. We fought longer for that elevator than we fought for all of France." German progress by late September was measurable but costly. The Sixth Army controlled approximately 70% of Stalingrad, including the city center and much of the northern industrial district. Soviet forces were compressed into 3 main pockets along the Volga: the northern factory district around the tractor factory, the central city around the ferry landing, the southern district near the grain elevator. German forces reached the Volga in multiple locations, physically splitting Soviet defenders. By every conventional measure, the battle was won. Soviet forces were outnumbered 5-1, running low on ammunition, taking horrific casualties. But Chuikov's 62nd Army refused to collapse. Reinforcements crossed the Volga nightly. Soldiers fought for buildings the way medieval armies fought for castles. Every room a stronghold. German casualty rates were unprecedented. 20,000 dead and wounded in September alone. German generals began questioning whether Stalingrad could be taken at acceptable cost. German soldiers began calling it Rattenkrieg, the War of the Rats, warfare where men crawled through sewers and ruins, where traditional tactics meant nothing, where victory was measured in rooms captured at the cost of squads destroyed. General Paulus, reviewing casualty reports in his headquarters on September 30th, confronted a mathematical nightmare. His army had suffered 35,000 casualties in September. Replacements arriving from Germany totaled 12,000. The Sixth Army was shrinking. Worse, veteran soldiers who understood mobile warfare on the steppe were being killed and replaced by raw recruits unfamiliar with urban combat. Tank losses were staggering. 120 tanks destroyed or disabled in September, mostly from close-range anti-tank weapons. The Luftwaffe still dominated the sky, but could not strike Soviet positions hugging German lines. Artillery continued its methodical pounding, but rubble absorbed explosions, and Soviet soldiers sheltered in basements artillery could not reach. Paulus requested reinforcements and was told reinforcements were unavailable, that the Sixth Army must complete its mission with existing forces. He studied his maps and realized a terrible truth. Stalingrad could be taken, but taking it would destroy the Sixth Army in the process. On October 1st, he issued orders for a renewed general offensive. Hitler demanded Stalingrad fall before winter. Paulus would obey, but he understood his men were being fed into a furnace that consumed armies. Vasily Chuikov, commanding the 62nd Army from his bunker on the Volga cliff face, understood Soviet defenses were unsustainable. Casualties in September exceeded 27,000 men. Fresh divisions crossed the Volga and were destroyed within days. Ammunition was critically low. Food rations were reduced to starvation levels. But Chuikov also understood that time was now working against Germans. Every day Stalingrad did not fall was a strategic victory. Autumn was transitioning to winter. The steppe would freeze, then snow would come. German supply lines stretching 1,200 miles across Russia would become vulnerable, and intelligence reports suggested massive Soviet forces were concentrating north and south of Stalingrad, hidden from German reconnaissance. Chuikov didn't know specifics. The Stavka kept operational planning secret even from frontline commanders, but he understood his mission had shifted. No longer was the objective holding Stalingrad indefinitely. The objective was holding long enough for something to happen elsewhere. On October 1st, he assembled his remaining officers and delivered a simple message. The Germans will attack again. They will reach the Volga. They will split us apart. But we will not break. We will hold each factory, each building, each room. We will make them pay in blood for every meter. And while we hold them here, something is coming. I don't know what. I don't know when, but something is coming. 4 weeks later, that something would arrive. October 2nd, 1942. Morning briefing at German 6th Army headquarters. Oberst Reinhard, a combat engineer with 3 months of Stalingrad experience, stands before a map showing the Red October factory, explaining to newly arrived officers how to clear a Soviet-held building. His voice is flat, mechanical, all enthusiasm burned away by grinding combat. "Forget everything you learned at officer school," he begins. "Urban warfare has its own rules. First rule, tanks are coffins. Don't use them except as mobile artillery. Second rule, grenades are your primary weapon. Carry 10 grenades for every rifle magazine. Third rule, never enter a room without throwing a grenade first. Fourth rule, the Soviets own the night. Never, ever attempt offensive operations after dark." He taps the map, showing a single factory building. This structure required 11 days to clear. 14 men died taking the ground floor. We used satchel charges to blow the stairwell, collapsed it entirely. Then we cleared the second floor by dropping grenades through holes in the floor. 6 men died. Third and fourth floors required 3 more days. He pauses, meets the eyes of lieutenants fresh from Germany. That single building cost us 28 dead, 47 wounded. And the Soviets still control the basement, attacking our positions at night. This is Stalingrad. This is Rattenkrieg. Welcome to hell. The evolution of German tactics in Stalingrad reflected brutal lessons learned through blood and failure. Traditional Wehrmacht doctrine emphasized combined arms, infantry, armor, artillery, and air power working together to break through enemy lines and exploit breakthroughs with mobile operations. In Stalingrad, that doctrine was useless. Armor could not maneuver in rubble-choked streets. Artillery and bombing had already destroyed most buildings, and further destruction simply created more defensive positions. The breakthrough and exploitation that defined Blitzkrieg was impossible when every room required assault, and every building was a fortress. By October, German commanders had developed specialized assault teams, 6 to 8 men units with specific roles, a squad leader with submachine gun and grenades, 2 flamethrower operators carrying torches that could burn defenders from fortifications, 2 or 3 riflemen with grenades, 1 or 2 machine gunners providing covering fire. These assault teams learned to move building by building, using sewers and connecting cellars to approach Soviet positions underground, emerging suddenly to overwhelm defenders before they could react. Soviet defensive doctrine evolved in parallel, codifying what worked and abandoning what didn't. Chuikov's concept of hugging the enemy meant keeping Soviet positions within 50 yards of German lines, often within grenade-throwing distance. This proximity neutralized German advantages in artillery and air power. Luftwaffe bombers couldn't strike Soviet positions without hitting German troops. Artillery fire was almost useless at such close range. The 62nd Army organized its own assault groups, storm groups of 6 to 8 men with specialized roles mirroring German tactics. A squad leader with submachine gun, typically the PP-41 with its 71-round drum magazine, 2 or 3 submachine gunners for close quarters fighting, 2 riflemen equipped as grenade throwers, each carrying bags containing 30 to 40 grenades, 1 or 2 soldiers with anti-tank rifles, the PTRS-41 or PTRD-41, weapons capable of penetrating light armor at close range. Sometimes a flamethrower operator joined the team, carrying the backpack-mounted ROKS flamethrower. The weapon preferences of both armies shifted dramatically in Stalingrad's ruins. Rifles, the traditional infantryman's primary weapon, became secondary. Their range and accuracy were useless in combat, occurring at 10 to 30 yards. Submachine guns dominated. German MP-40 Schmeissers and Soviet PPS-41s could deliver overwhelming firepower in confined spaces. Grenades became the primary weapon for both sides. German stick grenades, Soviet RGD-33 grenades, both sides consumed them by the thousands. Soldiers carried grenades in bags and pouches, grabbing them like handfuls of stones, throwing them around corners, through windows, down stairwells. Satchel charges, bags packed with explosives, became standard for breaching walls and collapsing floors. Sniper rifles gained new importance. Long-range precision shooting was impossible in the ruins, but snipers evolved into hunters, stalking specific targets, eliminating officers and machine gunners. creating psychological pressure that extended beyond their kill counts. The Mosin Nagant rifle, with its Pu-4 power scope, became the Soviet sniper's weapon of choice. October 14, 1942, the bloodiest single day of the battle. General Paulus launches what he intends as the final offensive, throwing 3 divisions and massive air support at the tractor factory district. The Luftwaffe flies over 3,000 sorties in one day, the most intense air assault of the Eastern Front. Bombs fall continuously from dawn until dusk. Soviet soldiers, sheltering in factory basements, feel the earth shake with each impact, describing it later as the day the world ended, or when the earth caught fire. German assault troops advance behind the bombing, expecting to find defenders stunned or dead. Instead, they encounter Soviet soldiers emerging from cellars and tunnels, disoriented but fighting. The 14th Panzer Corps pushes through the tractor factory grounds, reaches the Volga by evening, cutting the Soviet northern group off from Chuikov's headquarters. By nightfall, German forces have advanced 600 yards at the cost of 3,000 casualties. Soviet losses are estimated at 5,000. The ratio is improving for defenders, but the absolute numbers are catastrophic. The 62nd Army is being ground into paste, and reinforcements crossing the Volga are dying before they can impact the battle. Building clearing evolved its own terrible efficiency. German tactics emphasized vertical clearing, secure the ground floor with grenades and flamethrowers, blow the stairwell to prevent Soviet reinforcements from upper floors, then clear each level by punching holes through floors and dropping grenades or explosives down onto defenders below. This method was methodical but slow, and Soviet defenders learned to counter it. They fortified basements as primary positions, knowing German forces would focus on upper floors. They created firing positions where basement defenders could shoot at German troops on ground level through holes in rubble. They mined stairwells and approaches, turning every entrance into a potential death trap. And they used the underground network of sewers, tunnels, and connecting basements to move between buildings unseen, appearing behind German lines, attacking supply units and command posts, fading back underground before German reinforcements could respond. A German lieutenant described it in his diary. "We capture a building, clear every room, post guards. The next morning, we find our sentries dead with their throats cut. The Soviets have returned through tunnels we didn't know existed. We are fighting ghosts who live underground." Late October, 1942. The island of Colonel Ivan Lyudnikov's division exemplifies Stalingrad's desperate defense. Lyudnikov's 138th Rifle Division defends a pocket at the Barricady gun factory, measuring approximately 700 meters by 400 meters, pressed against the Volga, completely cut off from other Soviet forces. German forces surround the pocket on 3 sides, artillery and machine guns firing constantly into the condensed space. Lyudnikov's soldiers cannot be evacuated. German fire controls the Volga shoreline. They cannot be reinforced in meaningful numbers. Boats attempting to reach them are destroyed. Supply comes only at night, ferries racing across the Volga, delivering ammunition and minimal food, evacuating the most critically wounded. The island holds for 40 days, its perimeter shrinking meter by meter as German attacks push defenders back. Soldiers live in cellars beneath the factory, emerging only to fight. Dead cannot be buried. Bodies accumulate in cellars and ruins. Food is whatever can be scavenged. Rats, factory machine oil mixed with flour, occasionally bread delivered during night supply runs. Men suffering from dysentery, typhus, and wounds remain on the line because there is no rear area, no hospital. The island survives because its soldiers understand that surrender means death, and holding means death, so they might as well kill Germans while dying. The psychological toll of Rattenkrieg affected both armies profoundly. German soldiers, accustomed to mobile warfare and decisive victories, found themselves trapped in static, grinding combat where victories were meaningless. Capturing a building meant nothing when defenders reappeared the next night. Advancing 300 yards in a day represented success, but success that cost a company's worth of men. Letters home from German soldiers in October and November described the battle in apocalyptic terms. "This is not war as we knew it. This is murder conducted in ruins. We fight for a single room for 3 days, and when we take it, we find it contains nothing but corpses and rubble. The Soviets do not surrender. They fight until killed, then others appear from the ruins. How do you defeat an enemy that will not acknowledge defeat? German hospitals began treating what doctors called Stalingrad syndrome, uncontrollable trembling, inability to hold weapons, complete psychological breakdown. Some soldiers shot themselves rather than return to the ruins. Others became catatonic, staring into space, unresponsive. Soviet soldiers suffered equally but interpreted their suffering through different frameworks. Order 227 meant discussing psychological trauma was dangerous, potentially interpreted as defeatism. Political officers emphasized ideological purity. True Soviet soldiers felt no fear, only hatred for fascist invaders. Soldiers learned to hide psychological symptoms or interpret them as reasonable responses to impossible situations. Veterans developed dark humor and camaraderie that sustained them. They named buildings and positions. Hell's Kitchen, the Coffin, the Slaughterhouse. They made grim jokes about average life expectancy and competed over who had survived longest. They formed bonds with comrades that transcended normal military unit cohesion, understanding that in Stalingrad, you fought not for Stalin or communism, but for the man next to you, and he fought for you. When that man died, you fought to avenge him and to survive long enough to kill more Germans. The psychology was primal, stripped of ideology, pure survival instinct channeled into military effectiveness. By late October, both armies were exhausted. German 6th Army strength had declined from 330,000 in August to approximately 250,000 in November, with combat-effective infantry formations at 50% strength. Soviet 62nd Army had suffered over 80,000 casualties since September, replaced 3 times over with fresh divisions that were immediately fed into the fighting and destroyed. The daily routine had become ritualized. German attacks during daylight, exploiting air and artillery superiority. Soviet counterattacks at night, exploiting superior night fighting skills and underground movement networks. Both sides consuming ammunition, men, and morale at rates that could not be sustained indefinitely. Paulus requested permission to halt offensive operations and consolidate positions for winter. Hitler refused. Zhukov requested permission to evacuate non-essential personnel and establish reserve positions on the Volga's eastern bank. Stalin refused. Both armies were locked in mutual destruction, commanded by dictators who valued symbolic victory over military logic. In that context, Rattenkrieg would continue until one side literally could not fight anymore. The question was which side would break first. The answer was being prepared 300 miles away, where Soviet forces were concentrating for an operation that would make the Stalingrad city battle irrelevant. October 14, 1942. 6 o'clock in the morning, the sky above Stalingrad turns black, not from smoke or clouds, but from aircraft. 3,000 Luftwaffe sorties in a single day, the most concentrated air assault of the Eastern Front War. Junkers, 87s, Heinkel 111s, Stuka dive bombers, every available aircraft throwing itself at the tractor factory district where Soviet defenders cling to their final positions. Soviet soldier Nikolai Aksionov, sheltering in a factory basement, describes the sensation. The earth became liquid. Concrete walls swayed like trees in wind. Men screamed, but we couldn't hear them over the explosions. The ceiling cracked, dust and debris raining down, and we knew the factory above us was being destroyed piece by piece. We waited for the ceiling to collapse and crush us all. Some men prayed, others sat motionless, beyond prayer, beyond fear, waiting for death. The bombing continues for 8 hours without pause. When German infantry advances at 2 in the afternoon, they expect to find ruins and corpses. Instead, Soviet soldiers emerge from cellars and tunnels like the risen dead, and the fighting begins again. October 14th becomes known simply as the bloodiest day, when the intensity of violence exceeded human capacity to process it. The German offensive launched on October 14th was General Paulus's attempt to end the battle through overwhelming force. The 14th Panzer Corps, reinforced with the 94th Infantry Division and elite German pioneers, attacked along a 2-mile front toward the tractor factory and Barricade gun factory. Supporting the ground assault were 180 tanks, 800 artillery pieces, and the massive Luftwaffe presence. The objective was simple: smash through to the Volga, cut the 62nd Army into isolated pockets, destroy Soviet defenders before winter. German intelligence estimated Chuikov commanded perhaps 20,000 effectives after September's fighting. 3 German divisions totaling 45,000 men would annihilate them in days. The mathematics seemed indisputable. What German planners failed to account for was that Soviet soldiers fighting in ruins with their backs to the river didn't follow mathematical probability. They followed desperation mathematics, where being outnumbered 2-1 simply meant you needed to kill 2 Germans before dying yourself. The tractor factory battle became the epicenter of October's violence. The factory complex covered nearly 2 square miles, a maze of workshops, assembly halls, foundries, and administrative buildings connected by rail lines and underground passages. Before the war, it produced tractors. When war began, production shifted to 34 tanks, and even during the battle, damaged tanks were repaired in factory workshops, while combat raged in adjacent buildings. Soviet defenders transformed the factory into a fortress. Machine gun nests covered every approach. Anti-tank guns positioned in workshops fired directly down factory floors at approaching German armor. Snipers occupied elevated positions among the factory's steel framework. The basement network allowed defenders to move unseen, concentrating forces at threatened points, evacuating wounded through tunnels to the Volga shore. German forces attacking the tractor factory discovered that capturing the ground level meant nothing when Soviet troops controlled the cellars and could attack from below. October 23, 1942. German forces reached the Volga at multiple points, splitting Soviet defenses into 3 isolated pockets. The northern pocket, under Colonel Gorishny, holds the tractor factory ruins and a 500-meter stretch of riverbank. The central pocket, containing Chuikov's headquarters, controls the ferry landing and roughly 1 square mile of ruins. The southern pocket, the smallest, clings to positions near the Red October factory. German commanders celebrate, believing victory is days away. Paulus sends a cable to Army Group headquarters. Resistance is collapsing. 6th Army controls 90% of Stalingrad. Enemy forces split and isolated. Request permission to begin final elimination of pockets. Permission is granted with Hitler's personal endorsement, but the pockets do not collapse. Cut off from each other, unable to coordinate, each Soviet pocket fights independently with increased desperation. German casualties continue mounting. The 6th Army has spent 3 weeks of intense combat to advance from controlling 70% of Stalingrad to controlling 90%. The final 10% will cost more than the previous 90 combined. Soviet medical services in October faced impossible conditions. The 62nd Army's main hospital was located on the Volga's eastern bank, requiring wounded to be evacuated across the river under German fire. Lightly wounded soldiers remained on the line. A bullet wound through the arm or leg didn't qualify for evacuation unless it prevented holding a weapon. Severe casualties were moved to collection points along the Volga shore, then loaded onto ferries during night crossings. German artillery targeted the ferry routes constantly. Boats carrying wounded were hit regularly, burning or sinking with hundreds of soldiers who had survived combat only to drown or burn while evacuating. Dr. Vera Gurova, a military surgeon, described conditions. We operated in dugouts carved into the Volga cliff, using candlelight because electricity was unavailable. No anesthesia for most patients, we saved morphine for the most critical cases. Amputations were common. Gangrene spread rapidly in the filthy conditions. Men waited hours for treatment, lying on stretchers in tunnels, and many died waiting. The ones who made it to surgery had perhaps 50-50 survival odds. If they survived surgery and could be evacuated across the river, they might live. But crossing the Volga meant surviving German artillery. Some nights, 3/4 of the wounded died during evacuation. The October casualty rates were mathematically unsustainable for both armies. German 6th Army records show approximately 20,000 casualties in October, 12,000 wounded, 5,000 killed, 3,000 missing or captured. Soviet 62nd Army casualties exceeded 27,000, estimated 15,000 killed or missing, 12,000 wounded. But these raw numbers obscure the tactical reality. German casualties represented irreplaceable losses. Replacements arriving from Germany were raw recruits unfamiliar with urban warfare. Veteran infantry companies that had fought since June were now commanded by junior officers, their experienced NCOs dead. Soviet casualties were equally horrific in absolute terms, but the Soviet system could replace losses more readily. Fresh divisions staged on the Volga's eastern bank, waiting to cross. When a division was destroyed in Stalingrad, another division replaced it within days. The reinforcements were often poorly trained, equipped with minimal ammunition, and died quickly. But they kept coming. German soldiers called them flood waves, endless Soviet soldiers flowing into Stalingrad, dying, being replaced by more. October 29, 1942. Chuikov's headquarters nearly overrun. German assault troops penetrate to within 200 yards of the command bunker, carved into the Volga cliff. Chuikov's staff officers fight with pistols and grenades at the bunker entrance. Radio equipment is destroyed. Communications with Moscow are cut. For 6 hours, the 62nd Army's command structure ceases to function as Chuikov and his staff retreat through tunnels to a backup command post 300 yards south. German forces occupy the original bunker by noon, discovering maps and documents that confirm they nearly captured the Soviet commander. Soviet counterattacks that afternoon retake the bunker entrance but not the tunnels, leading to bizarre situations where German and Soviet troops occupy different sections of the same underground complex, separated by collapsed sections and barricaded passages. The headquarters is relocated 4 times in 3 days, constantly moving to avoid German advances. Chuikov later writes, "October 29th was the closest we came to complete disaster. Had we lost communications entirely, had I been killed or captured, the defense would have disintegrated. We survived by meters and minutes." The physical environment of Stalingrad in late October was beyond human comprehension. The city had been bombed, shelled, and burned continuously for 2 months. No intact buildings remained except portions of the factory complexes. Rubble covered streets to depths of 10 to 15 feet. Corpses lay everywhere, thousands of bodies buried in rubble or piled in cellars, rotting, creating a stench that permeated everything. Water sources were contaminated or destroyed. Soldiers drank from shell craters or melted snow. Food for Soviet troops was whatever crossed the Volga at night. Occasionally bread, more often hardtack, and canned food, sometimes nothing. German rations were better, but declining as supply lines stretched and partisan attacks increased. Both armies suffered from dysentery, typhus, and respiratory infections from breathing concrete, dust, and smoke. Lice infested everyone, spreading typhus. Men lived in cellars without sanitation, without heat, as October temperatures dropped toward freezing. The Volga hadn't frozen yet, but frost appeared at night. Winter was coming, and both armies were unprepared. German soldiers' letters home from October provided windows into their psychological state. One lieutenant wrote, "We have been fighting for the same factory building for 16 days. Every morning we attack, every evening we count our dead. Yesterday, we lost 37 men taking the 3rd floor. This morning, the Soviets were back, attacking from the basement. I no longer believe we will take this city. I believe this city will take us, will consume us all, and historians will write that the 6th Army disappeared into ruins and was never seen again." Another soldier, a private in the 389th Infantry Division, wrote his parents, "Do not believe what you read in newspapers about great victories. We are not victorious. We are dying. My company started with 140 men in August. We have 31. The replacements arrive from Germany and die within days. Tell my brother not to volunteer for the Eastern Front. Tell him to shoot himself first. It would be kinder." The letters were intercepted by military censors and never delivered. The soldier died November 3rd, killed by a sniper. Soviet soldiers developed coping mechanisms that bordered on fatalism. Veterans of September and October, fighting those rare individuals who survived 6 weeks, achieved a kind of numb acceptance. Lieutenant Anatoly Kozlov, who crossed the Volga on September 14th with the 13th Guards Division, was one of fewer than 300 survivors from his original 10,000-man division still fighting in late October. He described the mentality, "You stopped thinking about survival. Survival was random, determined by which piece of rubble you hid behind, which moment you raised your head, which direction a shell fragment flew. You couldn't control it, so you stopped trying. Instead, you thought about killing Germans. How many could you kill before you died? That became the only meaningful question. If you killed 3 Germans, your death had value. If you killed 10, you were a hero. The best snipers killed hundreds. We admired them not because they survived, but because they made their deaths meaningful by taking so many enemies with them. This psychology was functional in context, but would haunt survivors for decades after the war. By October 31st, as the month ended, both commanders understood the battle had reached a crisis point. Paulus calculated his army had suffered approximately 55,000 casualties since September 1st, nearly 17% of his original strength. Combat infantry divisions were at 40 to 50% effectiveness. The Sixth Army was destroying itself against Soviet defenses that refused to break. Winter was 3 weeks away. Supply difficulties were increasing. Paulus recommended halting offensive operations, consolidating positions, and resuming attacks in spring. Hitler rejected the recommendation absolutely. Stalingrad must fall before winter. The Sixth Army will continue attacks until Soviet resistance is eliminated. Chuikov, from his relocated command bunker, assessed his own forces. 25,000 combat effectives, adequate ammunition for perhaps 2 weeks of intense fighting, medical supplies nearly exhausted, food rations reduced to starvation levels. The 62nd Army was on the edge of annihilation, but intelligence reports suggested something was happening elsewhere, north and south of Stalingrad. Soviet forces were concentrating, movement detected behind enemy lines, rail shipments increasing. Chukov didn't know what was coming, but he understood his mission: hold Stalingrad through November, regardless of cost. If his army was destroyed in the process, so be it. Somewhere, someone was planning something, and whatever that something was, it required Stalingrad to remain in Soviet hands. On November 1st, he issued orders for continued defense. Every man fights where he stands, no retreats, no surrenders. We hold until relieved or until we are all dead. It was not rhetoric. It was literal operational doctrine. And across the ruined city, Soviet soldiers prepared to endure whatever November would bring. Late October, 1942, pre-dawn darkness over Stalingrad's ruins. Senior Sergeant Vasily Zaitsev, 27 years old, lies motionless in a hollow beneath twisted metal and broken concrete in the Lazar chemical plant district. He has been in this position for 4 hours, waiting. His Mosin Nagant rifle, with its Pu 4-power scope, rests on a brick barrel angled toward a German position 300 meters distant. Zaitsev doesn't move, doesn't adjust his position, breathes slowly through his nose to avoid creating condensation that might fog his scope. He is hunting. Not hunting soldiers in the abstract, but hunting one specific German sniper who has killed 11 Soviet soldiers in the past 3 days, including 2 of Zaitsev's students. The German is skilled, patient, and intelligent. He understands angles and shadows. He never shoots from the same position twice. But Zaitsev has studied the Germans' kills, plotted them on a map, analyzed the angles, and determined the likely area where the German operates. Now, it is a waiting game. Whoever moves first will die. The sun rises, painting ruins orange and gold. Somewhere in those ruins, another sniper waits in his own hollow, watching through his own scope. One of them will go home tonight. The other will become another corpse in Stalingrad's countless dead. Vasily Zaitsev came to Stalingrad as an ordinary soldier, a file clerk assigned to the Pacific Fleet who volunteered for frontline service when Germany invaded. Born in the Ural Mountains, he had learned to shoot hunting deer and wolves with his grandfather's rifle. That childhood hunting experience translated directly to military sniping. Patience, observation, understanding your prey's behavior, taking the single perfect shot. Zaitsev arrived in Stalingrad in September with the 284th Rifle Division, and within days demonstrated extraordinary marksmanship. By early October, he had achieved 40 confirmed kills. His political officer, Senior Lieutenant Danilov, recognized Zaitsev's propaganda value. The Soviet people needed heroes, needed stories of individual courage to counter the relentless bad news of German advances. Danilov wrote an article for the Red Army newspaper, Krasnaya Zvezda, describing Zaitsev's exploits. Noble sniper from the Urals who learned to shoot hunting wolves, now hunts fascists in Stalingrad's ruins. The article appeared on October 28th and transformed Zaitsev into a national celebrity overnight. Soldiers across the front read about him. His name became synonymous with Soviet resistance. And with fame came pressure to continue killing, to provide more stories for newspapers, to be the hero the Soviet people needed. Zaitsev's method was systematic and mathematical. He studied German patterns, identifying times when officers appeared, routes that patrols took, positions where German observers watched Soviet lines. He never fired more than once from the same position, knowing that German counter-snipers would target the muzzle flash or sound. He worked in pairs or teams, one sniper shooting while others provided security and observation. He trained other snipers, teaching them the 6 rules: patience, careful observation, skillful camouflage, clever approaches to the prey, determined action, and technical marksmanship. These rules sound simple but required immense discipline. Patience meant lying motionless for 8 to 10 hours, ignoring cold and discomfort, waiting for the perfect moment. Observation meant studying the battlefield, memorizing every brick and shell hole, noticing when something changed. Camouflage meant becoming part of the ruins, blending so completely that German observers looked directly at you and saw nothing but rubble. By late October, Zaitsev had trained 28 other snipers using these methods. Collectively, his school had killed over 300 Germans. The story of Major Erwin Koenig enters Zaitsev's memoir and Soviet propaganda in early November. According to Zaitsev's account, German command, frustrated by sniper losses, flew in a master sniper from Berlin to kill Zaitsev specifically. This sniper was allegedly Major Koenig, head instructor at the Wehrmacht Sniper School in Zossen, a legendary marksman tasked with eliminating the Soviet sniper hero. The duel lasted 3 days, a chess match conducted with rifles across Stalingrad's ruins. Koenig allegedly killed 2 Soviet snipers on the first day, demonstrating his skill. Zaitsev and his spotter studied the kills, determining Koenig's approximate position. They set traps, using mannequins and helmets to draw fire and reveal Koenig's location. On the 3rd day, November 3rd, Zaitsev and his spotter, Nikolai Kulikov, occupied a position overnight, waiting for dawn. At sunrise, Koenig allegedly made a fatal error. A German soldier raised his helmet briefly. Koenig shifted position to warn him, and sunlight glinted off his scope lens. Zaitsev saw the glint, aimed, and fired a single shot. Koenig died instantly, the bullet entering beneath his scope and penetrating his brain. The problem with the Koenig story is documentary evidence. German military records contain no Major Erwin Koenig serving at the Zossen Sniper School. No German after-action reports mention a master sniper sent to Stalingrad to duel Zaitsev. No death records match the described circumstances. Post-war researchers have searched extensively and found nothing. The Koenig duel appears to be either complete fabrication or a composite of multiple sniper engagements condensed into a single dramatic narrative. So why does the story persist? Because it served essential propaganda purposes. Soviet citizens needed heroes, needed stories where individual Soviet soldiers defeated elite German specialists. The duel between Zaitsev and Koenig became symbolic. Ordinary Soviet man, armed with basic rifle and revolutionary spirit, defeats aristocratic German expert with superior equipment. Whether Koenig existed historically is less important than the fact that millions of Soviet citizens believed he existed and believed Zaitsev killed him. The story sustained morale, provided hope, demonstrated that Germans were not invincible. But Zaitsev's actual achievements required no embellishment. By battle's end, he recorded 225 confirmed kills, each documented with witness verification and political officer approval. His tally was conservative sniper doctrine, required witnesses to confirm kills, meaning any shot without observers didn't count regardless of whether it hit. The true number was certainly higher. Zaitsev's impact extended beyond his personal kills. The 28 snipers he trained killed over 400 Germans collectively. More importantly, they spread his methods throughout the 62nd Army, creating a culture of sniping that multiplied effectiveness. German soldiers learned to fear open movement during daylight. Officers stopped wearing rank insignia that made them identifiable. Machine gunners worked in pairs so the second man could take over when the first was inevitably shot. Soviet snipers created attacks on German operations, a constant background threat that reduced efficiency and increased casualties in small but cumulatively significant ways. The propaganda aspect of Zaitsev's fame created complications. In late October and early November, while Stalingrad's defense teetered on the edge of collapse, Zaitsev was pulled from frontline fighting for propaganda events. He posed for photographs with his rifle. He was interviewed for newspaper articles. He met with visiting political officers and war correspondents. These activities were valuable for morale, but meant Zaitsev wasn't hunting Germans during those hours. The propaganda also painted a target on him. German forces knew his name, knew his face from captured Soviet newspapers, and made killing him a priority. Zaitsev had to move constantly, never staying in one position, always assuming German counter-snipers were specifically hunting him. The fame that made him a Soviet hero also made him more vulnerable. Several times, positions Zaitsev had recently occupied were destroyed by German artillery or airstrikes, suggesting intelligence about his location reached German command. Zaitsev survived these attacks through luck and paranoid caution. The psychological dimension of sniping warfare affected both armies. For Soviet soldiers, knowing snipers like Zaitsev were protecting them provided comfort. The randomness of artillery and bombing was unavoidable, but sniper fire felt personal, individual, a direct contest between humans. Zaitsev killing Germans made the incomprehensible violence of Stalingrad feel slightly more manageable, proof that individual skill and courage mattered. For German soldiers, Soviet snipers created pervasive anxiety. You could dig in against artillery, you could hide from aircraft, but snipers were invisible, patient, and lethal. Moving during daylight became nerve-wracking. Looking over parapet edges or through windows invited instant death. Officers were particularly vulnerable, as Soviet snipers targeted leadership specifically. A German company commander wrote in November, "We have stopped giving verbal orders during daylight. We use hand signals and written notes. 3 officers in our battalion have been shot giving orders." The men are terrified of Soviet snipers. Some refuse to stand upright, even in areas supposedly safe. The psychological impact exceeds the actual casualties. December 15, 1942. Zaitsev, now a lieutenant and holder of the Order of Lenin, is severely wounded when a German mine explodes near his position. Shell fragments pierce both eyes, blinding him temporarily and nearly killing him. He is evacuated across the Volga and eventually sent to Moscow for treatment by Professor Vladimir Filatov, the Soviet Union's leading ophthalmologist. Filatov performs experimental surgery, removing fragments and reconstructing Zaitsev's damaged eyes. Zaitsev regains sight in January 1943, though his vision is permanently impaired. He returns to military service, but not as a sniper. His visual acuity is insufficient for precision shooting. He trains other snipers and commands reconnaissance units for the war's remainder. His legacy, however, transcends his actual service. The story of Zaitsev became foundational to Soviet mythology about Stalingrad, the individual hero whose skill and courage symbolized Soviet resistance. The duel with Koenig, whether factual or fabricated, became canonical. Post-war Soviet films depicted it, novels included it, history textbooks taught it as fact. And in that teaching, truth and myth blended until distinguishing them became impossible and ultimately irrelevant. Zaitsev's actual kills, his training of other snipers, his genuine skill, all of that was real. Koenig might have been invention, but together, the real and the invented created a story that sustained Soviet morale when sustaining morale was as militarily essential as bullets and bombs. The broader significance of sniping at Stalingrad extended beyond individual marksmen. Both armies developed sniper training schools behind their lines, recognizing that trained snipers were force multipliers. German snipers typically operated independently, assigned to infantry companies, taking positions that offered good fields of fire. Soviet snipers worked in pairs or teams, emphasizing cooperation and mutual support. Both doctrines were effective in context. More importantly, sniper warfare at Stalingrad pioneered urban sniping techniques that became doctrinal for future conflicts. The use of ruins for concealment, the emphasis on patience and observation, the prioritization of high-value targets like officers and weapons crews, the psychological impact of sniper presence. All these elements were refined at Stalingrad and later applied in Berlin, Budapest, Grozny, Mogadishu, Fallujah, and every major urban battle since. Zaitsev didn't invent sniping, but his methods, disseminated through his students and through propaganda about his exploits, influenced how militaries worldwide approach urban warfare. In that sense, his legacy extends far beyond 225 confirmed kills in Stalingrad's ruins. He helped define how humans fight in cities, and that definition remains relevant 8 decades later. November 10, 1942, 100 miles northwest of Stalingrad, along the Don River near Serafimovich. Romanian Colonel Constantin Maitreya stands at his command post, binoculars raised, watching the river's western bank through morning fog. What he sees terrifies him. Soviet troops are massing, not small reconnaissance units or patrol groups, but entire formations, tanks, artillery, infantry by the thousands. The buildup has been continuous for weeks, hidden by autumn rain and fog, concealed from German aerial reconnaissance. Maitreya's 3rd Romanian Army defends 90 miles of frontage with 140,000 men, a ratio that violates every doctrine for defensive warfare. His soldiers occupy shallow trenches dug into frozen earth, inadequately supplied with anti-tank weapons, wearing summer uniforms as November temperatures drop below freezing. Behind them, German reserves are non-existent. Every available division has been fed into Stalingrad's city battle. Maitreya lowers his binoculars and returns to his dugout to compose a report for Romanian High Command and German Army Group B headquarters. He writes carefully, choosing words that convey urgency without suggesting panic. Enemy concentrations increasing across Don River, opposite our positions. Request immediate reinforcement and modern anti-tank weapons. Current defensive posture is inadequate to withstand major assault. The report reaches German headquarters 2 days later. It is filed and largely ignored. Stalingrad dominates all strategic thinking, and the flanks are considered secondary. The strategic situation on the German flanks was catastrophic, visible to anyone who studied maps objectively. The 6th Army's advance to Stalingrad had created a salient, a bulge in the front line extending 300 miles east from the main German positions along the Don River. This salient was vulnerable from north and south, its flanks held not by German divisions but by Allied armies, Romanian, Italian, and Hungarian formations. These Allied armies were equipped with obsolete weapons, undersupplied, and stretched impossibly thin across hundreds of miles of steppe. The Romanian Third Army held 90 miles with 140,000 men. Standard defensive doctrine recommended defending 25 miles maximum with that strength. The Italian Eighth Army to the north held 105 miles with 220,000 men, equally overstretched. The Hungarian Second Army held another sector. None of these Allied armies possessed the equipment, training, or motivation to withstand sustained Soviet attack. German commanders understood this intellectually but dismissed it as acceptable risk, because all planning focused on taking Stalingrad before winter. The Romanian Third Army's equipment situation exemplified the broader problem. Romanian anti-tank guns were primarily 37mm pieces, weapons effective against light armor in 1939, but useless against Soviet 34 tanks with their sloped 45mm frontal armor. Romanian artillery was a mix of captured French and Czech guns from the 1920s, ammunition often incompatible and in short supply. Romanian infantry carried rifles, some dating to World War I, with minimal machine gun support. Personal equipment was inadequate for Russian winter. Summer uniforms without winter overcoats, leather boots instead of felt valenki that Soviet soldiers wore. German promises of supply and re-equipment never materialized because German logistics prioritized the Sixth Army's needs. Romanian soldiers watched German supply columns pass them heading to Stalingrad and understood they were expendable, secondary, sacrificial. Morale deteriorated accordingly. Desertion increased. Officers reported to Bucharest that their men would not hold if seriously attacked. Soviet planning for the counteroffensive, later named Operation Uranus, began in September under the direction of General Georgy Zhukov and General Alexander Vasilevsky. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Strike the weak Romanian flank simultaneously from north and south, encircle the German Sixth Army in Stalingrad, then destroy it. The operation required unprecedented coordination. Over 1 million troops, 13,500 artillery pieces, 934 tanks, 1,115 aircraft, all positioned secretly while maintaining defensive operations in Stalingrad itself. The buildup occurred under strict maskirovka, Soviet military deception doctrine. Troop movements happened at night. Units arrived in sectors and stages, avoiding concentration that would alert German reconnaissance. Radio silence was absolute. Dummy positions and equipment created false impressions. German aerial reconnaissance photographed Soviet positions but couldn't distinguish real concentrations from deception. By November 10th, the Soviet assault forces were in position, and German intelligence had failed catastrophically to understand the threat. German intelligence officers at Army Group B headquarters did detect Soviet buildup, but their reports were dismissed or minimized. Colonel Reinhard Gehlen, head of Foreign Armies East Intelligence Section, submitted estimates in early November, suggesting over 1 million Soviet troops were concentrating opposite the Romanian and Italian sectors. His reports were met with skepticism. Hitler personally dismissed intelligence, suggesting major Soviet offensive capability, believing Soviet forces were exhausted and incapable of strategic operations. General Kurt Zeitzler, Army Chief of Staff, attempted to brief Hitler on the threat but was overruled. Hitler's logic was simple. The Soviets were fully committed to defending Stalingrad and had no reserves for offensive operations. Any troops detected north and south of Stalingrad were local forces, nothing more. This assessment was spectacularly wrong. The Soviet Union had mobilized millions of men since June 1942, established new armies east of the Urals, and now concentrated them for the largest encirclement operation in military history. But Hitler's certainty prevented effective response. November 12, 1942. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights over the Don River sectors return, with photographs showing extensive Soviet positions, tank concentrations, artillery parks, supply dumps. The photographs are analyzed at Army Group B headquarters. Intelligence officers calculate Soviet forces opposite the Romanian Third Army at 300,000 troops minimum, possibly more. The report reaches General Maximilian von Weichs, Army Group B commander, who forwards it to High Command with urgent request for reinforcements. Hitler's response, delivered via teletype on November 14th. Reports of Soviet concentrations are exaggerated. Enemy lacks capability for major offensive. Continue operations against Stalingrad. No forces available for redeployment to flanks. This assessment, issued 5 days before Operation Uranus launches, represents one of the war's greatest intelligence failures. The evidence was clear. The threat was obvious. And Hitler, through a combination of ideological certainty and strategic myopia, chose to believe his own assumptions over objective reality. The Italian Eighth Army, defending the Don River sector north of the Romanian positions, faced similar conditions. 220,000 Italian soldiers holding 105 miles meant each battalion defended frontages that should require division-level strength. Italian anti-tank weapons were even more inadequate than Romanian guns. The Italian Army's 47mm anti-tank gun could theoretically penetrate 34 armor at close range, but reliability was poor and ammunition limited. Italian soldiers, drafted from agricultural regions, had minimal training and even less motivation to die in Russia fighting for Nazi Germany. The alliance with Germany was unpopular in Italy, sustained by Mussolini's dictatorship rather than genuine national commitment. By November, Italian soldiers were aware German forces consumed resources they desperately needed, aware they were sacrificial screening forces protecting the German Sixth Army's northern flank. Italian officers reported to Rome that morale was near collapse, discipline breaking down, and desertion increasing. Rome forwarded these reports to German High Command with requests for relief or reinforcement. The requests were acknowledged and ignored. The strategic blindness extended beyond Hitler to encompass the entire German command structure. General Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, was aware his flanks were vulnerable but focused entirely on completing Stalingrad's capture. He had specific orders from Hitler. Take Stalingrad before winter. The flanks were someone else's responsibility, specifically Army Group B's problem. General Maximilian von Weichs, commanding Army Group B, understood the danger but lacked reserves to address it. Every German division in southern Russia was committed to frontline operations, either in Stalingrad itself or the Caucasus campaign to the south. No strategic reserve existed. If the flanks collapsed, there was nothing to stop Soviet exploitation except improvised responses. This situation represented catastrophic failure of strategic planning. German doctrine emphasized maintaining operational reserves for counterattacks and exploiting opportunities. But the twin objectives of Stalingrad and the Caucasus had consumed all available forces, leaving nothing in reserve. The Wehrmacht had trapped itself through overextension, and Soviet command understood this perfectly. November 15, 1942. Soviet Marshal Zhukov and General Vasilevsky briefed Stalin on Operation Uranus in the Kremlin. Using maps and operational charts, they explained the plan. Simultaneous attacks from north and south, encircling the Sixth Army, creating a pocket that can be destroyed methodically. Stalin asks pointed questions about timing, logistics, and risk. The offensive is scheduled for November 19th, 4 days away. Weather forecasts predict fog and snow, perfect conditions for concealing the attack and grounding Luftwaffe support. Zhukov estimates 72 hours to complete encirclement, then weeks to destroy German forces inside the pocket. Stalin approves the operation with one modification. Once encirclement is complete, no attempt to negotiate Sixth Army's surrender. The Germans will be given the choice of annihilation or surrender without terms. Stalin's reasoning is both ideological and practical. Ideologically, fascist invaders deserve no mercy. Practically, destroying an entire German army will shatter Wehrmacht morale and convince Hitler's allies that continuing the war means certain defeat. The meeting concludes at midnight. Operation Uranus is confirmed. In 4 days, the Battle of Stalingrad will transform from urban warfare nightmare into strategic catastrophe for Nazi Germany. The Romanian and Italian soldiers manning the Don River positions in mid-November had no idea they were about to face over 1 million Soviet troops supported by nearly 900 tanks. They knew Soviet forces were present across the river, knew attacks were likely, but couldn't imagine the scale of what approached. Romanian Private Ion Popescu, occupying a frozen trench near Kletskaya, wrote his final letter home on November 17th. "We are cold and hungry. The Germans take all supplies for their own needs. Our officers say the Russians will attack soon, but we have no ammunition beyond what we carry, no anti-tank weapons, no mines. If the Russians come with tanks, we have no defense. I think of home constantly. Pray for us." The letter reached Bucharest in December, after Popescu was already dead or captured, after the Romanian Third Army had ceased to exist as a military formation. His words represented hundreds of thousands of Allied soldiers who understood they were sacrificed for German strategic objectives they neither understood nor supported. Operation Uranus would exploit this understanding, transforming demoralized Allied troops into gateways for Soviet armor to pour through and encircle the city that both Stalin and Hitler had made the war's symbolic center. November 19th, 1942, 7:20 in the morning. Romanian Third Army positions along the Don River northwest of Stalingrad. The fog is thick, visibility perhaps 50 yards, frozen moisture hanging in the air like a gray curtain. Romanian soldiers huddle in their trenches, stamping feet against the cold, waiting for daylight to burn off the fog. Then the world explodes. 3,500 Soviet artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front, the largest artillery barrage in history to that point. The sound is indescribable, not individual explosions, but a continuous roar that obliterates all other sensation. Romanian Lieutenant Florin Constantinescu, commanding a forward company, feels the earth shake beneath him, watches as shells impact across his positions in systematic patterns, walking forward in timed increments. Men scream, but he cannot hear them over the bombardment. A shell lands directly in a trench section 30 yards away, and the section simply ceases to exist, vaporized. The barrage continues for 80 minutes without pause. When it lifts at 8:50, Romanian survivors emerge from whatever cover they found, disoriented, many bleeding from ears ruptured by concussion. They have seconds to prepare. Then the Soviet tanks appear through the fog, dozens of them, 34 mediums, advancing in lines, crushing barbed wire, firing machine guns. Behind the tanks come Soviet infantry by the thousands, shouting, "Ura!" as they charge. The Romanian defense collapses in hours. The northern pincer of Operation Uranus launched with overwhelming force, carefully concentrated at weak points. Soviet Southwestern Front, commanded by General Nikolai Vatutin, committed 3 armies, the 21st, 65th, and 5th Tank Army. The 5th Tank Army was the Strategic Exploitation Force, 430 tanks, primarily 34s and T-70s, with orders to break through Romanian positions, then drive south at maximum speed toward Kalash, where bridges cross the Don River. The 21st and 65th Armies would widen the breach and prevent German counterattacks. The assault sectors were chosen precisely, areas held by the weakest Romanian divisions, positions with minimal natural defensive advantages, sectors where German reserves were farthest away. Soviet intelligence had done its work. Every Romanian battalion position was mapped, every artillery battery location identified. The assault was not improvisation, but surgical strike against catastrophically vulnerable enemy. Romanian resistance collapsed with shocking speed. The Third Army's defensive positions were shallow trenches with minimal overhead cover, offering no protection against artillery. Romanian soldiers, already demoralized by weeks of inadequate supply and German contempt, broke under the bombardment. When Soviet tanks appeared, Romanian anti-tank gunners discovered their 37mm shells bounced off 34 armor, unless fired at point-blank range. Crews abandoned guns and fled. Infantry companies, seeing their anti-tank defenses destroyed and Soviet armor approaching, retreated without orders. Command and control disintegrated. Radio equipment was destroyed by artillery. Phone lines were cut. Runners couldn't navigate the chaos. By 10 o'clock in the morning, 2 hours after the barrage ended, Soviet forces had penetrated 16 miles through Romanian positions. The Third Romanian Army was not retreating in good order, but fleeing in panic. Thousands of soldiers abandoning weapons and equipment, walking east toward German rear areas hoping to find safety. Romanian officers tried to rally their men and failed. Some officers fled with their troops, others shot themselves rather than face capture or the shame of total defeat. The Soviet 5th Tank Army, under Lieutenant General Pavel Romanenko, exploited the breakthrough with aggressive speed that vindicated Soviet deep battle doctrine. Tank brigades poured through the breach, bypassing Romanian strongpoints, driving toward the Don River bridges. Soviet doctrine emphasized exploitation. Once defensive lines were broken, drive deep into enemy rear areas, disrupt command and logistics, prevent organized response. The 5th Tank Army executed this perfectly. By afternoon on November 19th, lead elements were 30 miles beyond the initial breakthrough line. German rear area units, supply convoys, and headquarters suddenly found Soviet tanks appearing where no Soviet tanks should exist. The psychological shock was as significant as the physical destruction. German soldiers in Stalingrad, focused on reducing the final Soviet pockets in the city, suddenly realized something catastrophic was happening behind them. Radio messages reported Soviet breakthroughs. Orders came to send reinforcements north. But what reinforcements? Everything was committed to Stalingrad's city battle. November 20th, 7:30 in the morning. The southern pincer launches. Soviet Stalingrad Front, commanded by General Andrei Yeremenko, attacks Romanian 4th Army and remnants of German 4th Panzer Army south of Stalingrad. The pattern repeats: massive artillery barrage, tank-led assault, Romanian defenses collapsing. The southern attack uses 5th Mechanized Corps and 57th and 51st Armies, totaling 300,000 troops and 575 tanks. Romanian 4th Army's defensive positions are even weaker than 3rd Army's, strung across 70 miles with inadequate depth. Within hours, Soviet forces breach Romanian lines in multiple locations. German 4th Panzer Army's remnants, already depleted from months fighting at Stalingrad's southern approaches, cannot contain the breakthrough. By midday, Soviet mechanized forces are driving northwest. advancing parallel to the northern pincer, moving toward the same objective, Kalach, where the two pincers will meet and seal the Sixth Army's doom. General Friedrich Paulus, in his Sixth Army headquarters at Golubinskaya, receives fragmentary reports of Romanian collapse on November 19th evening. The reports are confusing, contradictory, incomplete. Some suggest local Soviet attacks. Others describe catastrophic breakthroughs. Paulus cannot get clear picture because Romanian command structure has disintegrated and German liaison officers are out of communication. On November 20th, with southern attacks underway, the scale becomes apparent. Both flanks are collapsing simultaneously. Soviet tank forces are driving toward his rear areas. Paulus faces decision: continue Stalingrad assault or withdraw the Sixth Army while escape routes remain open. He requests permission from Army Group B to halt Stalingrad operations and redeploy forces to meet the Soviet threat. General Maximilian von Weiss forwards the request to Hitler's headquarters with recommendation for immediate Sixth Army withdrawal. Hitler's response comes hours later. Sixth Army will hold current positions. No withdrawal authorized. The Volga must be held. Paulus, trained to obey orders, complies. This decision, more than any tactical mistake, dooms the Sixth Army. November 22nd, early afternoon. Soviet tank forces from north and south meet at Kalach, 50 miles west of Stalingrad. Two Soviet tank corps, the 26th from the north and the 4th Mechanized from the south, link up near the Don River bridges. German garrison forces at Kalach fight briefly, then surrender or flee. The encirclement is complete. Trapped inside a pocket roughly 30 miles east to west and 25 miles north to south are approximately 250,000 German and Axis troops, the entire Sixth Army, elements of 4th Panzer Army, remnants of Romanian divisions, a Croatian regiment. The pocket contains Stalingrad itself, the territory the Sixth Army spent 3 months capturing, and vast stretches of empty steppe. Paulus receives confirmation at his headquarters. The army is encircled. He transmits this information to Army Group B, with renewed request for permission to break out. The Soviet ring is still thin. German forces significantly outnumber Soviet troops directly facing them on the pocket's perimeter. With proper coordination, breakthrough is possible. But breakthrough requires abandoning Stalingrad, abandoning heavy equipment, accepting casualties during retreat. Most critically, it requires Hitler's approval. The speed of Operation Uranus shocked German command. From initial attacks on November 19th to complete encirclement on November 22nd required only 98 hours, 4 days to destroy 2 Allied armies and trap Germany's most powerful field army. The operation succeeded through multiple factors. Soviet planning was meticulous, the buildup hidden through deception, the assault timed for weather that grounded Luftwaffe support. Romanian and Italian forces were inadequately equipped and demoralized, collapsing faster than even Soviet planners expected. German strategic reserves were non-existent, all forces committed to frontline operations. German command responded slowly, hindered by Hitler's insistence on holding every position. Most fundamentally, Operation Uranus exploited the strategic overextension created by pursuing Stalingrad and Caucasus simultaneously. German forces were stretched impossibly thin. The flanks were vulnerable. Soviet command identified the vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. Inside the newly formed pocket, German soldiers reacted with confusion and disbelief. Units fighting in Stalingrad's ruins had no immediate awareness of encirclement. They continued urban combat operations, taking positions, fighting Soviet defenders, dying for control of factories and apartment blocks that no longer mattered strategically. Only gradually, as supply deliveries stopped and orders arrived to consolidate positions defensively rather than attack, did the reality penetrate. Corporal Heinrich Wittmann, serving with the 389th Infantry Division in the Red October Factory District, wrote in his diary on November 23rd, "No food delivered today. Orders to establish defensive perimeter. Rumors that Russians have cut us off. Officers deny this, but the men don't believe the denials. If we are encircled, how do we escape? The Volga is behind us, Russians everywhere else. We are trapped." His assessment was correct. The Sixth Army occupied Stalingrad, but was itself occupied by Soviet forces surrounding the pocket. Soviet casualties during Operation Uranus were significant but acceptable within Soviet operational calculus. Estimates suggest approximately 80,000 Soviet casualties during the four-day encirclement operation, 40,000 killed or missing, 40,000 wounded. Romanian casualties were catastrophic. Third Army lost approximately 75,000 captured and 25,000 dead, ceasing to exist as functional force. Fourth Army suffered similarly. German casualties during the encirclement itself were relatively light, perhaps 5,000, because German forces weren't the primary Soviet targets. The Romanians absorbed the initial assaults, and German units were bypassed rather than destroyed. But the encirclement trapped 250,000 German soldiers in a pocket with limited supplies, winter approaching, and Soviet forces concentrating for their destruction. The immediate casualties were less significant than the strategic catastrophe. Germany had lost the initiative on the Eastern Front and would never regain it. November 23rd, evening. Joseph Stalin receives confirmation that encirclement is complete. He summons Zhukov and Vasilevsky to the Kremlin for celebratory meeting. Cognac is poured. Stalin offers a rare toast to the commanders who planned Operation Uranus, to the soldiers who executed it. Today, we have proven that fascist armies can be defeated, can be encircled, can be destroyed. Stalingrad is now a trap, and we hold the keys. The strategic implications are enormous. For the first time since Operation Barbarossa began in June 1941, Soviet forces have encircled and trapped a major German formation. The psychological impact on Soviet morale is immediate and profound. News spreads across the Soviet Union. The Germans are surrounded at Stalingrad. The defenders who held the ruins for months now have a chance for victory. The Eastern Front's momentum has shifted. What follows will be months of brutal combat to destroy the pocket and prevent German relief attempts. But the fundamental strategic situation has changed irrevocably. Hitler's obsession with taking Stalingrad has delivered the Sixth Army into a trap from which there may be no escape. And in that trap, the outcome of the Second World War's Eastern Front will be decided. November 24th, 1942. The Wolf's Lair, Hitler's headquarters. Adolf Hitler sits at the conference table. General Kurt Zeitzler standing before him with maps showing the Stalingrad encirclement. Zeitzler has been arguing for 2 hours that the Sixth Army must break out immediately while Soviet forces are still organizing. Hitler refuses. Stalingrad cannot be abandoned. The Volga must be held. Winter positions will be established. The conversation reaches impasse. Then Hermann Göring, Reich Marshal and Luftwaffe commander, enters the room. He has been briefed on the situation and sees opportunity to restore his diminished prestige with the Führer. Mein Führer, Göring announces confidently. The Luftwaffe can supply the Sixth Army by air. We will deliver everything they need until ground forces re-establish contact. Zeitzler immediately protests, calculating aloud. Sixth Army requires 700 tons of supplies daily. The Luftwaffe cannot possibly deliver that amount. Göring waves off the objection. The Luftwaffe will supply 300 tons per day, minimum, sufficient for the army to hold until relieved. Hitler seizes on this promise. If the Sixth Army can be supplied by air, then withdrawal is unnecessary. The army can hold Stalingrad indefinitely. Hitler issues his decision. Sixth Army will establish hedgehog defense and await relief. Göring's promise has sealed their fate. The mathematics of the airlift were damning from the outset. Sixth Army supply officers calculated requirements precisely. 300 tons of fuel daily to operate vehicles and generators. 200 tons of food to sustain 250,000 men on reduced rations. 200 tons of ammunition and equipment, replacement weapons, medical supplies, winter clothing. Total minimum requirement, 700 tons per day. Göring promised 300 tons. Even if that promise was kept, the army would slowly starve and freeze. But Luftwaffe logistics experts knew even 300 tons was fantasy. The Luftwaffe possessed approximately 750 transport aircraft, primarily Junkers 52 trimotors, each capable of carrying 2 to 3 tons. These aircraft were scattered across Europe, supporting other operations. Concentrating them at Stalingrad would take weeks. Weather in November and December meant only 25 to 30% of days had conditions suitable for flying. Soviet fighters controlled airspace increasingly, and the pocket's airfields would be under constant artillery fire. Colonel Fritz Morzik, Luftwaffe transport commander, calculated that sustained delivery of 300 tons daily was impossible. He reported this to Göring. Göring dismissed the report and repeated his promise to Hitler. The airlift began on November 25th, with 75 Junkers, 52 transports flying from Tatsinskaya and Morozovskaya airfields, 200 miles west of the pocket. The first missions delivered 47 tons of supplies to Potomnik airfield inside the pocket, then returned under Soviet fighter attack. 2 aircraft were shot down. Weather on November 26th grounded all flights. November 27th saw better conditions. 110 tons delivered. The pattern established itself. Weather, Soviet fighters, and airfield conditions created massive variability. Some days delivered over 100 tons. Other days delivered nothing. The November average was 97 tons per day, barely 1/7 of minimum requirements. 6th Army supply officers rationed immediately. Fuel consumption was restricted to essential vehicles only. Food rations were reduced to 300 grams of bread per day per soldier, supplemented by horse meat from cavalry and artillery horses. Ammunition was conserved strictly. Non-critical equipment was abandoned or cannibalized for parts. The Luftwaffe transport crews faced nightmare conditions. Tatsinskaya and Morozovskaya airfields became hellscapes of overcrowding and confusion. Hundreds of aircraft parked wingtip to wingtip. Fuel supplies were inadequate, forcing crews to wait hours for refueling. Loading supplies was chaotic, ground crews often unable to keep pace with flight schedules. Then came the flight itself, 200 miles across steppe, increasingly controlled by Soviet fighters. The Lavochkin 5 and Yakovlev 9 fighters prowled the routes, attacking transport formations. Junkers 52s, slow and unescorted because fighter escorts consumed fuel needed for supply flights, were easy targets. Crews watched comrades' aircraft explode or spiral down trailing smoke. Inside the pocket, Potomnik airfield was under constant Soviet artillery fire. Transport pilots approached through flak, landed quickly, kept engines running while ground crews unloaded supplies and loaded wounded for evacuation. Then, immediate takeoff, hoping to escape before Soviet artillery bracketed the runway. Many aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Others crashed, attempting to take off from damaged runways. The mortality rate for transport crews was staggering. December brought worse conditions. Temperatures dropped below -20 degrees Celsius. Fuel froze in aircraft lines, requiring heating before engines would start. Runways iced over, making takeoffs and landings treacherous. Daylight hours shortened, reducing flying time. Soviet fighters became more aggressive, their pilots more skilled, and Soviet ground forces tightened the pocket, pushing closer to Potomnik airfield, bringing it within artillery range. December's delivery average was 137 tons per day, still far below requirements. Inside the pocket, soldiers began starving. The bread ration dropped to 200 grams daily, then 100 grams. Horse meat became the primary protein source. Soldiers slaughtered horses systematically, first cavalry mounts, then artillery horses, finally the workhorses pulling supply wagons. When horses were gone, men ate whatever they could find. Leather boots were boiled for their minimal nutrition. Wallpaper paste was consumed. Rats were hunted. Starvation diseases appeared, scurvy, beriberi, edema. Men's bodies consumed their own muscle mass. Physical deterioration was rapid and irreversible. General Paulus, receiving daily supply reports showing the airlift failing catastrophically, repeatedly requested permission to break out. On December 5th, he transmitted message to Hitler: Army starving, no fuel for vehicles, ammunition critically low, airlift delivers 1/6 of requirements. Casualties from starvation and cold exceeding combat casualties. Request immediate permission to break out toward Kotelnikovo. Hitler's response: 6th Army will hold positions. The Luftwaffe will increase supply deliveries. Relief operation is being organized. Expect relief within weeks. Paulus, bound by military discipline and his own character, obeyed. He distributed Hitler's message to his commanders, emphasizing that relief was coming, that the airlift would improve, that the army must hold. Many officers didn't believe him but had no alternative. The army was encircled. Breaking out without Hitler's permission meant court-martial and execution, so they stayed and waited and watched their men starve. The Luftwaffe's losses mounted catastrophically. From November 24th through January 31st, 488 transport aircraft were destroyed, shot down by fighters, destroyed on airfields by artillery or bombing, crashed due to weather or mechanical failure, abandoned when airfields were overrun. Over 1,000 aircrew were killed or missing. The transport fleet was decimated. Aircraft that survived flew until they literally fell apart from overuse and inadequate maintenance. Goering's promise had consumed the Luftwaffe's transport capacity and achieved nothing. By January, deliveries averaged under 100 tons daily. The pocket's garrison was dying of starvation regardless of combat operations. And still, Hitler refused to authorize withdrawal, clinging to the belief that relief would arrive, that Stalingrad could be held, that his will could overcome logistical reality. Inside the pocket, soldiers' letters home reflected deepening despair. A corporal in the 76th Infantry Division wrote in mid-December, "We have eaten all the horses. There is nothing left. The bread ration is 100 grams, barely 2 slices, and even that doesn't come every day. Men are collapsing from hunger. The cold is beyond description. We have no winter clothing. Many men have frostbite. The field hospitals cannot treat everyone. We are told relief is coming, but no one believes it anymore. We are abandoned here to die." The letter was never sent. It was found on the soldier's frozen body in January. Military censors intercepted thousands of such letters, preventing them from reaching Germany. The truth of Stalingrad's horror was suppressed to maintain civilian morale. German newspapers reported heroic resistance and impending relief. The reality was starvation, disease, and slow death for men abandoned by High Command's delusions. December 11th. A Junkers 52 approaching Potomnik airfield through heavy fog. The pilot, Hauptmann Hermann Zehe, has flown 17 missions into the pocket, seen too many comrades die, and knows the airlift is failing. His aircraft carries 1 ton of bread and medical supplies, utterly inadequate for the men below. Soviet fighters appear through the fog. Zehe's rear gunner fires his machine gun, knowing it's futile. A Soviet fighter's cannon shells tear through the Junkers fuselage. Fire erupts. Zehe orders his crew to bail out. 2 men jump. Zehe and the others stay with the burning aircraft, trying to glide it to the airfield rather than crash in Soviet-controlled territory. They almost make it. The Junkers hits ground 500 meters short of the runway, explodes, kills everyone aboard. German soldiers watching from Potomnik perimeter see the fireball. Another crew dead, attempting the impossible. The bread and medical supplies burn. And somewhere in the cold, Goering sleeps comfortably in his mansion, 2,000 miles from the consequences of his promises. The airlift he promised would save the Sixth Army was killing it as surely as Soviet bullets. December 10th, 1942. Inside the Stalingrad pocket, the Kessel, as German soldiers call it, the cauldron. Private Werner Hoffmann, 22 years old, occupies a bunker dug into frozen earth near the Potomnik airfield. He has not eaten in 36 hours. His last meal was horsemeat broth, boiled from bones already boiled twice before, flavored with nothing but salt. His bread ration, supposedly 100 grams daily, has not arrived for 3 days. Supply flights are irregular, and what little they deliver goes first to frontline units actively fighting. Hoffmann is rear area personnel, aircraft, ground crew, low priority for food. He is starving, literally starving, his body consuming itself. He has lost 30 pounds since encirclement began. His uniform hangs loose. His belt is cinched to the tightest notch, and still his trousers sag. He thinks constantly about food, dreams about food, remembers specific meals from his childhood in Bavaria with hallucinatory intensity. His fingers are blackened with frostbite. He wears every piece of clothing he possesses: 2 undershirts, uniform shirt, uniform tunic, a jacket taken from a dead Romanian soldier. He has no winter coat. The Luftwaffe was supposed to deliver winter clothing, but delivers nothing. Hoffmann's bunker mate, also ground crew, died 3 days ago from typhus. The body is still there, frozen, because they have no strength to carry it outside and no place to bury it. The ground is frozen solid, and they have no tools for digging anyway. This is life in the Kessel. This is what Göring's promises have delivered. This is the reality for 250,000 men trapped in the Stalingrad pocket. The pocket's geography defined its misery. Roughly 30 miles east to west, and 25 miles north to south, containing Stalingrad's ruins. 3 operational airfields, Pitomnik, Gumrak, and Stalingradsky, and vast stretches of empty steppe. The terrain offered minimal natural protection from winter weather. Most soldiers lived in zemlyankas, dugouts carved into earth and covered with logs or metal sheets, heated by improvised stoves burning whatever fuel could be found. Fuel was scarce, wood was scarce. Coal was non-existent. Men burned furniture, documents, wooden ammunition crates, anything flammable. When nothing else remained, they simply endured the cold. Temperatures in December averaged -20 to -30 Celsius, with extremes reaching -40. Soldiers without winter clothing froze. Sentries on exposed positions froze at their posts. Men sent outside to urinate froze their genitals. Frostbite casualties exceeded combat casualties by December's end. Food supplies collapsed as the airlift failed. The official ration in early December was 300 grams of bread, 100 grams of meat, and minimal fats and vegetables. By mid-December, the ration dropped to 200 grams of bread and horse meat. By late December, 100 grams of bread, sometimes 50 grams, sometimes nothing. The army began slaughtering horses systematically. The Sixth Army entered the pocket with approximately 10,000 horses. By January, fewer than 1,000 remained. Horses were killed, butchered, and distributed. Every part was used. Muscle meat fed soldiers, bones were boiled for broth, organs were eaten, hides were cut into strips and boiled for their minimal protein. When horses were exhausted, cats and dogs in Stalingrad's ruins were hunted. Rats were trapped and eaten. Desperate men experimented with anything potentially edible. Leather boots boiled for hours until they became gelatinous paste. Wallpaper paste scraped from walls. Machine oil mixed with flour. Starvation induced creativity and horror in equal measure. Medical conditions deteriorated catastrophically. The Sixth Army medical services were designed to treat combat casualties, not administer to an army dying from starvation and disease. Field hospitals were overwhelmed. The wounded couldn't be evacuated because transport aircraft prioritized bringing supplies in over taking wounded out, and even when aircraft had space, only the most critical cases were selected for evacuation. The rest remained, recovering or dying in hospitals that lacked medicine, anesthetics, bandages, heating, and food. Typhus spread through the pocket carried by lice that infested every soldier. Lice thrived in the filthy conditions where men couldn't bathe or change clothes. Typhus symptoms, high fever, delirium, rash, were death sentences in the pocket's conditions. Estimated 70,000 cases of typhus occurred between November and February. Mortality was high. Dysentery spread through contaminated water and food. Men developed chronic diarrhea that weakened them further. Frostbite required amputation, but surgeons lacked anesthetics. Amputations were performed with soldiers held down by comrades, screaming, often dying from shock. The field hospitals became warehouses of suffering, places soldiers feared more than combat. Christmas 1942 in the pocket was a mockery of tradition. The German army attempted to maintain morale through Christmas celebrations. Extra rations were promised but rarely delivered. Christmas trees were improvised from scraps. Carol singing was encouraged. Some units held services, reciting traditional Christmas prayers in frozen dugouts by candlelight. Officers distributed letters from home that had arrived on supply flights, reading messages from families who had no idea their soldiers were starving. One soldier, Corporal Johannes Metzger, wrote in his diary, "Christmas Eve. We sang Silent Night in our bunker. 6 men with voices weak from hunger, singing about peace and holy calm while Soviet artillery shells explode overhead. The irony was too bitter. Some men wept, others sat silent. Our Christmas meal was 100 grams of bread and broth, made from bones boiled 3 times. This is what we have come to. We are dying here, and at home they think we are heroes. Metzger died January 18th of typhus. Early January 1943. The Soviet offensive to destroy the pocket operation ring has not yet begun, but Soviet forces tighten their grip incrementally. Artillery fire increases. Patrol actions probe German positions. The pocket's perimeter shrinks slowly as Soviet troops capture outposts, and German forces withdraw to conserve strength. Each withdrawal means abandoning positions, falling back towards Stalingrad's center, condensing the pocket. Men are too weak to carry equipment. Weapons are abandoned. Ammunition is left behind. The defensive perimeter contracts not through Soviet assault, but through German exhaustion. Soldiers ordered to new positions walk slowly, stopping frequently to rest, some collapsing and freezing to death during the march. Officers try to maintain unit cohesion, but struggle when men lack strength to obey orders. Discipline deteriorates. Theft of food becomes common. Men steal from comrades, from supply dumps, from the dead. Military hierarchy breaks down as survival instinct overrides everything else. The psychological transformation was profound. German soldiers who entered Stalingrad as members of the Wehrmacht's elite Sixth Army, conquerors of Poland and France, believers in German superiority, were reduced to starving animals fighting for scraps. Identity dissolved. Ideology became irrelevant. Politics meant nothing. All that mattered was surviving one more day, finding one more piece of bread, staying warm enough to avoid freezing. The dehumanization was mutual. Soviet soldiers attacking the pocket saw German defenders as pathetic scarecrows, barely alive, hardly worth killing because cold and starvation would do the job anyway. German soldiers saw each other with similar cold calculation. Each man who died was one less competitor for food, one more body to loot for clothing or supplies. Camaraderie persisted in pockets, small groups of men sustaining each other through shared suffering. But the broader unit cohesion that defines military effectiveness disintegrated. By January, the Sixth Army was an army in name only. It was 200,000 dying men, occupying a shrinking space, waiting for relief that would never come or death that arrived daily. January 7th, 1943. Soviet forces deliver an ultimatum: surrender or face annihilation. The ultimatum is transmitted via loudspeaker and dropped as leaflets over German positions. General Paulus is offered honorable surrender. His men guaranteed treatment according to international law. Wounded would receive medical care. All prisoners would be fed. The deadline is January 9th. Paulus transmits the ultimatum to Hitler, requesting permission to accept. Hitler's response is immediate and absolute. Surrender is out of the question. The Sixth Army will hold its position to the last man and last bullet. Every day you hold ties down Soviet forces and serves the German cause. Paulus obeys. The ultimatum is rejected. Soviet forces prepare for final assault. Inside the pocket, soldiers learn of the rejected surrender and realize their leadership has sentenced them to death. Suicides increase. Men shoot themselves rather than endure slow starvation. Others become fatalistic, welcoming combat as preferable to waiting to freeze. The pocket has become a death trap, and everyone inside knows it. The average daily death rate in the pocket during January exceeded 3,000 men. Not all died from combat. Starvation, disease, and cold killed more than Soviet bullets. Bodies accumulated faster than burial details could handle them. Corpses were stacked outside field hospitals, frozen solid, awaiting burial in mass graves that couldn't be dug because the ground was frozen and soldiers lacked strength for digging. Some bodies were simply left where they fell, covered by snow, forgotten. The demographic collapse of the Sixth Army was unprecedented. In early November, pre-encirclement, the army numbered 265,000 men. By mid-January, approximately 190,000 remained alive. 75,000 casualties in 70 days. Many from non-combat causes. The Sixth Army was dying wholesale, organizational death occurring in real time, observable to everyone trapped inside. And still Hitler ordered them to hold, still Paulus obeyed, still men died for symbolic value of terrain that mattered to no one, except two dictators whose egos required sacrifice without end. January 10th, 1943. A doctor in a field hospital writes his final diary entry. Doctor, Karl Ostermann, 6th Army Medical Corps, has treated thousands of casualties since encirclement began. He has amputated limbs, treated typhus, watched men die from starvation and cold. His entry reads, "The men lying in the hospital can no longer be called human beings. They are ghosts, skeletal figures with hollow eyes, skin stretched over bones. Many have lost 60 to 80 pounds. They cannot walk, cannot feed themselves. Some have lost the will to live, and simply lie waiting for death. I am a doctor, trained to heal, but I have nothing to heal with. No medicine, no food, no warmth. I can only watch them die and record their names for records that will never reach their families. We have lost. This is not military defeat. This is human extinction occurring in slow motion. Future generations will read about Stalingrad and wonder how this was allowed to happen. I have no answer. I only know that I am here, and I will die here, and there is nothing I can do about it." Doctor. Ostermann died January 23rd. His diary was found on his body and recovered by Soviet troops. It was never returned to his family. December 12, 1942. 125 miles southwest of Stalingrad, near the town of Kotelnikovo. Field Marshal Erich von Manstein stands in his command vehicle, studying maps by lamplight, calculating odds that he knows are terrible. Hitler has appointed him to command the newly formed Army Group Don with one impossible mission: relieve the 6th Army, trapped in Stalingrad. Manstein is Germany's finest operational commander, the architect of the French campaign's breakthrough at Sedan, the conqueror of Sevastopol. If anyone can achieve the impossible, it is Manstein. But even genius has limits. His relief force consists primarily of the 4th Panzer Army, 2 understrength panzer divisions, the 6th and 23rd, totaling approximately 230 tanks, supported by the 17th Panzer Division arriving piecemeal. Against him, Soviet forces are concentrating. Entire armies redeployed from other fronts, hundreds of tanks, defensive positions being fortified daily. The mathematics are brutal. Manstein must advance 125 miles through Soviet-held territory, break through prepared defenses, reach the pocket, and somehow extract the 6th Army, or, at minimum, open a supply corridor. He has perhaps 1 week before Soviet reinforcements make the task impossible. At dawn, Operation Winter Storm will begin. Manstein knows it is likely a suicide mission. He launches it anyway because failure to attempt relief means condemning 250,000 men without even trying to save them. The strategic context of Winter Storm was catastrophic from conception. Ideally, relief operations coordinate with breakout. External forces attack inward, while trapped forces attack outward, meeting in the middle, overwhelming defenders caught between. But Hitler forbade 6th Army breakout, insisting Stalingrad be held. This meant Manstein must drive all the way to the pocket's perimeter, while Paulus waited passively. Even if Manstein reached the pocket, then what? The 6th Army lacked fuel for vehicles, had eaten most horses, and had men too weak to march. Evacuating 200,000 soldiers through a narrow corridor while under Soviet attack was impossible. The only viable outcome was establishing permanent corridor for supply, but Soviet forces would immediately attack to sever it. Winter Storm was attempting to solve an unsolvable problem created by Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal when escape was possible. December 12th, dawn. German artillery opens fire along the Volga River south of Stalingrad. 4th Panzer Army attacks northward, 6th Panzer Division leading with 100 tanks. Soviet resistance is immediate and heavy. The 2nd Guards Army, elite troops transferred from the Moscow front, defends the sector with determination that surprises German commanders. The advance makes good progress initially, 10 miles the first day, 15 miles the second. German tank crews, veterans of 2 years of mobile warfare, execute combined arms operations effectively. But Soviet resistance stiffens daily. Anti-tank guns positioned in depth destroy German tanks systematically. Soviet tanks counterattack, 34s engaging German Panzer III's and IV's in swirling battles across frozen steppe. By December 15th, 4th Panzer Army has advanced 40 miles but suffered 30% tank losses. The advance is slowing. Soviet reinforcements arrive daily while German strength diminishes. December 19th. The critical moment. 4th Panzer Army reaches the Volga River, 30 miles from Stalingrad's pocket perimeter. This is the closest relief forces will ever get. German forward units can hear artillery fire from Stalingrad. Radio contact with 6th Army confirms the pocket is aware relief is approaching. Inside the pocket, soldiers allowed themselves hope for the first time in weeks. Relief was 30 miles away. Perhaps they would survive after all. Manstein transmits coded message to Paulus. Prepare for Operation Thunderclap. Break out toward 4th Panzer Army. Coordinate attack for December 22nd. The message creates crisis in 6th Army headquarters. Paulus understands breaking out means abandoning Stalingrad, abandoning heavy equipment, marching men who can barely walk 30 miles through Soviet-held territory in minus 30-degree cold. He calculates casualties would be catastrophic. More critically, Hitler has forbidden abandoning Stalingrad. Paulus requests clarification from Hitler. The response arrives December 20th. 6th Army will hold current positions. 4th Panzer Army will continue advance. No breakout authorized. December 20th. Soviet counteroffensive strikes Manstein's relief force. The Soviet 2nd Guards Army attacks 4th Panzer Army's spearhead, while 5th Shock Army hits the flanks. The tank battle at Volga River is vicious. Dozens of tanks burning on both sides, infantry fighting in frozen villages. German tank strength drops below 100 operational vehicles. Soviet reinforcements continue arriving. Manstein recognizes the offensive has failed. Continuing forward means destroying 4th Panzer Army without saving the 6th Army. On December 23rd, he orders withdrawal. 4th Panzer Army retreats, fighting rearguard actions, abandoning gains purchased with thousands of casualties. The relief attempt has failed. Inside the pocket, soldiers who allowed themselves hope feel it die. A lieutenant writes in his diary, "We heard the artillery from the relief force for 3 days. We thought they would reach us. Now the artillery sounds are receding. They are retreating. We are abandoned. There will be no relief. We will die here." He was correct. The failure of Winter Storm was overdetermined, doomed by multiple factors, any one of which might have prevented success. Hitler's refusal to authorize 6th Army breakout meant the relief force had to do everything alone. Soviet numerical superiority meant German forces were outnumbered increasingly as the offensive progressed. Winter weather favored defenders, making mobile operations difficult. The distance was too great, the relief force too weak, the timeline too compressed. But the fundamental problem was strategic. Hitler prioritized symbolic possession of Stalingrad over military logic. Had the 6th Army broken out on December 19th, when relief was closest, perhaps 100,000 men could have escaped the pocket. Casualties would have been terrible, equipment would have been lost, but the army might have survived as a formation. Instead, Hitler's order to hold position condemned the army to annihilation. Paulus obeyed that order, bound by discipline, character, and belief that disobeying would lead to court-martial and execution. The relief attempt failed not because Manstein lacked skill or his soldiers lacked courage, but because the mission was impossible under constraints Hitler imposed. December 24th, Christmas Eve. 4th Panzer Army has retreated 40 miles south of the Volga River, establishing defensive positions. The relief attempt is officially over. Manstein transmits final report to Hitler. Winter Storm has failed. 4th Panzer Army lacks strength to reach 6th Army. Soviet forces too strong. Recommend immediate authorization for 6th Army breakout before Soviet ring becomes impenetrable. Even with high casualties, breakout offers only chance for Army's survival. Hitler's response comes December 25th, Christmas Day. 6th Army will establish fortress defense. Luftwaffe will increase supply deliveries. New relief operation will be organized in spring. The 6th Army's resistance serves vital strategic purpose by tying down Soviet forces. This response represents complete detachment from reality. There would be no spring. The 6th Army would not survive winter. And the vital strategic purpose was mythology designed to justify abandoning 250,000 men to death or captivity. Inside the pocket, news of the failed relief attempt spread despite official censorship. Soldiers at the perimeter had heard 4th Panzer Army's artillery, watched the sounds recede, understood what it meant. Officers attempted damage control, reading Hitler's messages about future relief and spring operations. Few believed it. The psychological impact was crushing. For 3 weeks, men had sustained themselves on hope that relief was coming, that they would be saved, that survival was possible. When that hope died, many men's will to continue died with it. Suicides increased dramatically after Christmas. Officers found soldiers who had shot themselves, written final letters explaining they preferred death to slow starvation. Others became catatonic, sitting in bunkers staring at nothing, unresponsive to orders or encouragement. The Sixth Army was experiencing collective psychological collapse, organizational death through destroyed morale. They would continue fighting because they had no alternative, but the fighting would be mechanical, without hope, the actions of dead men who hadn't stopped moving yet. The 6th Panzer Division, which led the relief attempt, suffered 55% casualties during winter storm. Tanks destroyed, crew killed or wounded, infantry companies reduced to platoon strength. The division retreated south and was rebuilt, participating in later campaigns. But the soldiers who survived carried psychological scars. They had come within 30 miles of the trapped 6th Army, had heard their comrades' radio messages begging for relief, and had been forced to retreat, leaving 250,000 men to die. Tank Commander Hauptmann Hermann von Witzleben wrote after the war, "We tried. God knows we tried. We fought through Soviet positions, destroyed their tanks, killed their soldiers. We got so close we could see Stalingrad burning on the horizon. Then we were ordered to retreat. I will never forget the radio messages from Stalingrad as we withdrew. Men begging us to come back. Men asking why we abandoned them. Men cursing us for leaving. We didn't abandon them. We were ordered to retreat. But the guilt remains. We got close enough to save them and failed. This guilt was shared by thousands of 4th Panzer Army survivors, men who lived while comrades died, who followed orders, knowing the orders meant death for others. Manstein himself bore the operation's failure with characteristic professionalism but private anguish. He understood military reality. Winter storm was a desperate gamble with minimal success probability, but understanding didn't eliminate the human cost or the moral weight of sending men to die in an attempt he knew was likely futile. Post-war, Manstein defended his decisions, arguing that attempting relief was mandatory regardless of odds, that military honor required exhausting all possibilities before abandoning trapped soldiers. Critics argued Manstein should have refused the mission or insisted on 6th Army breakout as prerequisite for relief. The debate continued for decades. What is indisputable is that Winter Storm's failure sealed the 6th Army's fate. After December 24th, no realistic hope for relief remained. Soviet forces would tighten the noose systematically, and the men inside the pocket would die slowly or surrender when resistance became impossible. The 30 miles that separated 4th Panzer Army from Stalingrad on December 19th might as well have been 300. The distance was unbridgeable under Hitler's orders, and those orders would cost Germany one of its finest armies and 250,000 irreplaceable soldiers. The failure at the Maishkova River was tactical. The failure in Hitler's headquarters was strategic and catastrophic. December 16th, 1942. The Middle Don River, 150 miles northwest of Stalingrad. Italian 8th Army positions, thinly stretched across 105 miles of front. The morning is cold and foggy, visibility minimal. Italian soldiers huddle in their inadequate trenches, stamping feet against cold that penetrates their summer-weight uniforms. They have been told winter clothing is coming, but it never arrives. They watch the Don's western bank nervously, aware that Soviet forces are massing there, but uncertain when attack will come. Then, at 7:30 in the morning, the Soviet Voronezh Front and Southwestern Front launch Operation Little Saturn. 1,000 artillery pieces open fire simultaneously. The barrage is shorter than Operation Uranus, but equally devastating. Italian positions, constructed hastily in frozen ground, offer minimal protection. Shells destroy bunkers, sever communications, kill men sheltering in trenches. When the barrage lifts 90 minutes later, Soviet infantry and tanks attack across the frozen Don. Italian defenders fight initially, anti-tank guns engaging Soviet armor, infantry firing from positions. But the defense is hopeless. Soviet numerical superiority is overwhelming. By midday, Soviet forces have breached Italian lines in multiple locations. By evening, the Italian Eighth Army's front is collapsing. What follows is catastrophe. Operation Little Saturn was originally conceived as Operation Saturn, a far more ambitious plan to drive southwest toward Rostov, cutting off German Army Group A, fighting in the Caucasus, and potentially trapping hundreds of thousands of additional German troops. But Winter Storm's relief attempt towards Stalingrad forced Soviet command to scale back. Instead of driving to Rostov, Little Saturn aimed for Tatsinskaya and Morozovskaya, the airfields supplying the Stalingrad pocket. Destroying these airfields would end the airlift and doom the Sixth Army absolutely. The operation deployed 425,000 Soviet troops, over 1,000 tanks, 5,000 artillery pieces. Against them, the Italian Eighth Army, 220,000 soldiers with obsolete equipment, minimal anti-tank weapons, no winter clothing, and morale destroyed by months of German contempt and inadequate supply. The Italian army's collapse was rapid and comprehensive. Unlike the Romanian armies during Operation Uranus, which dissolved in panic almost immediately, Italian formations fought initially before breaking. The Alpini Corps, elite mountain troops from northern Italy, conducted fighting retreats with considerable skill and courage. But courage cannot compensate for overwhelming disadvantage in numbers, equipment, and logistics. Soviet tank brigades penetrated Italian positions, driving deep into rear areas, disrupting command and control, cutting supply lines. Italian infantry, lacking anti-tank weapons that could penetrate 34 armor, found themselves bypassed and surrounded. Units fought until their ammunition was exhausted, then surrendered or attempted to break out. The breakouts became nightmares. Italian soldiers, wearing summer uniforms in -30-degree cold, marched through frozen steppe hoping to reach German lines. Many froze to death during the march. Others were captured by Soviet cavalry or partisan units. Some reached German positions and were disarmed, treated as defeated allies, sometimes worse. December 18th, the Battle of Nikolaevka. The Italian Alpini Corps, approximately 40,000 men, attempts to break through Soviet encirclement. They fight a desperate rearguard action, hand-to-hand combat with knives and bayonets, officers leading charges into Soviet machine gun positions. For one day, the Alpini achieve what seems impossible. They break through Soviet lines and march toward German positions. But the cost is catastrophic. Of 40,000 men, perhaps 15,000 escape encirclement. The rest are dead, wounded, or captured. The Alpini's sacrifice becomes legendary in Italian military history, an example of courage under impossible circumstances. But courage does not change outcomes. The Italian Eighth Army has ceased to exist as a military formation. Survivors straggling into German lines are traumatized, frostbitten, starving. Many require immediate medical treatment. Others simply collapse and die after reaching safety. The Italian Army's Eastern Front participation is effectively over. Soviet exploitation forces, particularly the 24th Tank Corps, commanded by Major General Vasily Badanov, drive deep into German rear areas. Badanov's corps, equipped with 34 and T-70 tanks, advances over 120 miles in 6 days, capturing Tatsinskaya Airfield on December 24th. The airfield is critical to the Stalingrad airlift. When Badanov's tanks appear, chaos erupts. Transport aircraft are loaded and attempting to take off. Crews panic. Some aircraft take off successfully. Others crash attempting emergency takeoffs. Badanov's tanks fire into parked aircraft, destroying dozens. The airfield is captured, its facilities destroyed, the airlift crippled. German forces counterattack, surrounding Badanov's corps, forcing him to fight his way out. Badanov escapes with heavy losses, but has accomplished his mission. Tatsinskaya is gone. The airlift must relocate to more distant airfields, reducing deliveries further. The Sixth Army's starvation accelerates. The strategic impact of Little Saturn extended beyond tactical destruction of Italian Eighth Army. Soviet advances threatened the entire southern wing of German forces in Russia. The breakthrough created a 200-kilometer gap in German lines. Soviet armored spearheads advanced toward Rostov, threatening German supply routes for Army Group A fighting in the Caucasus. If Rostov fell, German forces in the Caucasus would be trapped. Hitler was forced to authorize Army Group A's withdrawal from the Caucasus, abandoning the oil fields that were supposed to fuel German war machine. The operation Germany launched in Summercase Blue to capture Caucasus oil had failed completely. Not only had Stalingrad become a death trap, but the Caucasus campaign was abandoned. German strategy in southern Russia lay in ruins. All of this resulted from Hitler's insistence on taking Stalingrad, regardless of strategic cost. Italian casualties during Little Saturn were horrific. Official Italian records list 84,830 casualties from the 8th Army's 220,000 men, approximately 50,000 killed or missing, 35,000 wounded or frostbitten. The true numbers were likely higher, as many men simply disappeared into Soviet captivity or died during retreats, their fates unrecorded. Italian prisoners of war faced conditions similar to German POWs: inadequate food, minimal medical care, forced labor, disease. Survival rates were low. Of Italian soldiers captured on the Eastern Front, fewer than 40% returned to Italy after the war. The Italian military's Eastern Front disaster contributed to Italy's political collapse in 1943, Mussolini's overthrow, and Italy's eventual switch to the Allied side. The soldiers who died on the Don River, freezing in inadequate uniforms, abandoned by German allies, fighting for Axis objectives they neither understood nor supported. Their deaths were meaningless sacrifices to Hitler's strategic delusions. December 24, 1943. Soviet forces capture Tatsinskaya airfield. The same day, Morozovskaya airfield comes under attack. These two airfields handled the majority of flights into the Stalingrad pocket. Their loss means the airlift must operate from airfields 250 to 300 miles distant, doubling flight times, cutting deliveries in half. Inside the pocket, the impact is immediate. Flights that were delivering 100 tons daily drop to 50 tons, then less. The Sixth Army's starvation, already critical, becomes terminal. Soldiers' daily bread ration drops to 50 grams or nothing. Horses have been eaten. There is nothing left. Men die of starvation at rates exceeding combat deaths. Medical officers report that soldiers are too weak to fight, even when ordered. The Sixth Army is dying wholesale, and Little Saturn has accelerated the death by destroying the airlift's logistics. The pocket has become a dying organism, metabolism shutting down, death only a matter of time. The German response to Little Saturn was improvised and desperate. Manstein, commanding Army Group Don, was forced to withdraw 4th Panzer Army from its positions after Winter Storm's failure and redeploy it to stem Soviet breakthroughs. German divisions were pulled from other sectors, rushed north, thrown into defensive positions to prevent Soviet advance to Rostov. The German front stabilized eventually, but at catastrophic cost. Reserves that might have been used for another Stalingrad relief attempt were consumed, stopping Little Saturn's exploitation. The Hungarian Second Army, holding positions north of the Italian Eighth Army, suffered similar fate when Soviet forces attacked in January, adding another Allied army to the list of formations destroyed on the Eastern Front. By January 1943, the entire southern wing of German forces in Russia was in retreat or surrounded. The Wehrmacht's strategic position had collapsed, and the collapse originated from Hitler's decision to pursue Stalingrad and the Caucasus simultaneously, overextending forces until Soviet counteroffensives shattered the overstretched line. Soviet casualties during Little Saturn were significant but acceptable within Soviet operational calculations. Estimates suggest 70 to 90,000 casualties during the operation, approximately 35,000 killed or missing, 55,000 wounded. These losses were high but justified by strategic gains. The Italian Eighth Army was destroyed, critical airfields captured, German relief attempts disrupted. The path was cleared for final destruction of the Sixth Army in Stalingrad. For Soviet command, Little Saturn demonstrated that Wehrmacht allies were vulnerable, that satellite armies could be defeated easily, and that German strategic overextension created opportunities for devastating counteroffensives. This lesson would inform Soviet operations for the war's remainder. Nazi Germany's reliance on Hungarian, Romanian, Italian, and other Allied armies to hold extended fronts While German forces concentrated for offensives created systemic weakness, Soviet commanders exploited ruthlessly. Little Saturn was proof of concept. Future operations would replicate its success, destroying Germany's allies and isolating German forces for defeat in detail. The Italian soldiers who froze on the Don River, the Romanian soldiers who fled in panic, the Hungarian soldiers who would die in subsequent operations, all were casualties of Hitler's strategic incompetence and callous disregard for Allied armies treated as expendable cannon fodder. January 8, 1943, midday. A Soviet delegation approaches German lines carrying white flag. The delegation reaches the forward positions of the Sixth Army's perimeter and delivers a written ultimatum to General Paulus. The document is formal, clinical in its phrasing. The Sixth Army is encircled. Your situation is hopeless. Further resistance leads only to unnecessary bloodshed. The Soviet command proposes surrender with the following guarantees: personal safety for all officers and soldiers, medical care for wounded, normal rations, retention of personal effects and decorations, eventual repatriation to Germany. Response required by 9 a.m., January 9th. The ultimatum reaches Paulus at his headquarters in the Uvermag department store basement in Stalingrad center. He reads it, understands its logic, knows it is the rational choice. But rationality has no place in this battle. Hitler has forbidden surrender. The Sixth Army will fight to the last. Paulus drafts his response. Ultimatum rejected. The Sixth Army will defend its positions. Surrender is out of the question. The response is transmitted to Soviet command. The final assault will proceed. Operation Ring, the systematic destruction of the Stalingrad pocket, begins at dawn January 10th. The Soviet plan for Operation Ring was methodical annihilation. 7 armies totaling 281,000 troops, 257 tanks, 10,000 artillery pieces would attack the pocket from west and south, compressing it toward the Volga, splitting it into smaller pockets, then destroying each pocket individually. The Don Front commander, General Konstantin Rokossovsky, planned the operation with industrial efficiency. First, artillery bombardment would pulverize German positions. Second, infantry and tank assaults would breach the perimeter. Third, exploitation forces would drive deep into the pocket, capturing airfields and splitting German forces. Finally, isolated German pockets would be reduced through systematic assault. The entire operation was estimated to require 10 to 15 days. German resistance would be fierce initially, but collapses starvation, cold, and casualties destroyed combat capability. Rokossovsky's assessment was accurate. The Sixth Army was already dying. Operation Ring would accelerate the process. January 10th, 5:05 in the morning. Soviet artillery begins firing. 7,000 guns and mortars, the most concentrated bombardment of the war, impact the western edge of the pocket. The barrage continues for 80 minutes. Systematic destruction of German positions. German soldiers, weakened by starvation, huddle in bunkers, feeling the earth shake. Many bunkers collapse, burying men alive. When the barrage lifts, Soviet infantry and tanks attack. German resistance is fierce in places, pathetically weak in others. Some units fight effectively, using remaining ammunition and anti-tank weapons to inflict casualties. Other units, too weak from starvation to operate weapons, surrender immediately. Soviet forces advance steadily. By day's end, they have penetrated 5 miles into the pocket. The compression has begun. January 12th through 16th. Soviet forces systematically capture German strongpoints. The advance is grinding, methodical. Every fortified building requires assault. Every bunker complex must be reduced. But German defenders are weakening daily. Ammunition is running out. Food is non-existent. Medical supplies are exhausted. Men fight until they literally cannot lift weapons, then surrender or die. On January 16th, Soviet forces capture Potomnik Airfield, the pocket's primary landing field. The airlift, already failing, now operates only from Gumrak Airfield, closer to Stalingrad's center. Deliveries drop to near zero. The Sixth Army's logistics collapse completely. Paulus transmits message to Hitler. Potomnik lost. Gumrak under artillery fire. Airlift suspended. Army starving. Ammunition nearly exhausted. Request permission for final breakout attempt or surrender. Hitler's response: surrender is forbidden. Every day of resistance serves Germany's cause. The Sixth Army will fight to the last. January 21st. Soviet forces capture Gumrak airfield. The airlift is finished. No more supply flights. No more evacuation of wounded. The Sixth Army is completely isolated. Supplies exhausted. Men dying by thousands daily. The pocket shrinks to 15 miles east to west, compressed against Stalingrad's ruins and the Volga. German forces are split into two pockets. Northern pocket holding factory district, southern pocket holding city center. Communication between pockets becomes difficult as Soviet forces control the ground between. Both pockets continue fighting independently, but coordination is impossible. The Sixth Army has fractured into isolated groups fighting separate battles, each awaiting death or surrender. January 26th. Soviet forces reach the Volga at Mamayev Kurgan, the hill where fighting began in September. The pocket is split completely now. Northern Group, approximately 50,000 men under General Karl Strecker, holds the tractor factory and Northern Industrial District. Southern Group, approximately 140,000 men under Paulus's direct command, holds Stalingrad's center. Soviet forces control the ground between them. The pockets cannot support each other. Both will be destroyed separately. Inside both pockets, conditions are beyond description. Men too weak to walk lie in cellars waiting for death. Wounded die untreated. The dead are stacked like cordwood, frozen solid. Typhus is universal. Frostbite has crippled thousands. Soldiers urinate and defecate where they lie, too weak to move. The smell is overwhelming. These are not military formations anymore. They are dying masses of humanity trapped in ruins, awaiting annihilation. January 30th. Hitler's personal message to Paulus, delivered via radio. You are promoted to Field Marshal. No German Field Marshal has ever surrendered. Fight to the last. The message's meaning is clear. Hitler expects Paulus to commit suicide rather than surrender, to die heroically like a proper Nazi commander. Paulus receives the promotion coldly. He understands Hitler is manipulating him, using historical precedent to pressure suicide. But Paulus is exhausted, starving, and realistic. His men are dying. Fighting achieves nothing. Hitler's rhetoric cannot change reality. On January 31st, Soviet troops storm the Univermag department store, where Paulus has his headquarters. Paulus does not resist. He does not commit suicide. When Soviet officers enter the basement at noon, they find Paulus sitting at a table, recently promoted Field Marshal insignia on his uniform. He surrenders formally, the first German Field Marshal in history to be captured. His choice represents rationality prevailing over ideology, but it comes too late to save his men. February 1st through 2nd. The southern pocket collapses. German units surrender en masse, too weak to continue fighting. Soviet soldiers photograph columns of German prisoners, skeletal figures shuffling through snow, barely able to walk. The prisoners are terrified of Soviet captivity, but also relieved fighting is over. On February 2nd, the northern pocket under General Strecker surrenders after Paulus's surrender becomes known. By 10 a.m., all German resistance in Stalingrad has ended. The Battle of Stalingrad is over. Soviet casualties for the entire battle, from defensive operations in September through Operation Ring, 1,129,619. Total casualties, 478,741 killed or missing. 650,878 wounded. German casualties, approximately 500,000 dead, wounded, or missing during the entire campaign. 91,000 German and Axis troops enter Soviet captivity. Of those 91,000, approximately 6,000 will survive to return to Germany by 1956. The destruction is complete. Soviet forces raising the red flag over Mamayev Kurgan on February 2, 1943, photograph themselves for propaganda purposes. The images show Soviet soldiers, exhausted but victorious, standing atop ruins where fighting was most intense. Below them, the city of Stalingrad is devastated beyond recognition. 99% of buildings destroyed, tens of thousands of corpses buried in rubble. the Volga ice covered with frozen blood and bodies. The victory has cost the Soviet Union over 1 million casualties and destroyed a major industrial city. But the victory is total. Germany's Sixth Army, the formation that conquered Poland and France, has been annihilated. Hitler's strategic offensive in southern Russia has failed catastrophically. The initiative on the Eastern Front has passed to Soviet forces permanently. Nazi Germany will never recover from Stalingrad. The war will continue for 2 more years, but the outcome is no longer in doubt. Stalingrad has become the turning point, the moment when German defeat became inevitable. And the turning occurred not through brilliant Soviet strategy or heroic resistance alone, but through Hitler's strategic incompetence, his refusal to authorize withdrawal when escape was possible, his sacrifice of 250,000 men for symbolic possession of ruins. The men who died in Stalingrad, German and Soviet alike, died for Stalin and Hitler's egos, for symbolic victories meaningless in military terms, for terrain that mattered only because dictators declared it mattered. The tragedy of Stalingrad was not just the casualties, but the senselessness, the waste, the preventable suffering inflicted by leaders who valued their pride over human life. January 31st, 1943, 11:45 in the morning. The basement of the Univermag department store, Stalingrad's center. General Friedrich Paulus sits at a wooden table in the dim light of a kerosene lamp, his uniform immaculate despite the chaos surrounding him. He is 49 hours into his tenure as field marshal, the rank Hitler bestowed on him 2 days ago, with the clear expectation that Paulus would commit suicide rather than surrender. But Paulus is not dead. He is waiting. Soviet infantry has stormed the department store's upper floors, fighting room by room toward the basement. Gunfire echoes through the building. Paulus's staff officers stand around him, weapons holstered, understanding the end has come. At noon, Soviet soldiers burst into the basement, rifles raised, shouting commands in Russian. Paulus stands slowly, his movements deliberate. Through an interpreter, he identifies himself. I am Field Marshal Paulus, commander of the German Sixth Army. I am your prisoner. It is the most significant moment of the battle. No German field marshal has ever surrendered in history. The precedent is broken. Within hours, news will spread through the pocket. The commander has surrendered. For thousands of German soldiers, Paulus's capitulation provides permission to stop fighting, to choose survival over pointless death. The surrender of the southern pocket begins. The circumstances of Paulus's surrender reveal the psychological complexity of command under impossible conditions. For 2 days after Hitler's promotion, Paulus had debated his options. Suicide would maintain Nazi honor and fulfill Hitler's expectations, but suicide would accomplish nothing for his dying men. Paulus understood that continuing resistance was militarily pointless. The southern pocket contained approximately 140,000 men, but perhaps 20,000 were combat effective. The rest were wounded, sick with typhus, starving, or simply too weak to fight. Ammunition was nearly exhausted. Soviet forces surrounded them completely. Breakout was impossible. Relief would never come. The only rational choice was surrender, but surrender violated Hitler's direct order and broke German military tradition. Paulus chose rationality. His decision was not heroic. He waited until Soviet troops were at his headquarters door, rather than proactively seeking surrender terms. But by surrendering formally, rather than committing suicide, he provided example for other commanders. Throughout the pocket, German officers who had continued fighting from duty rather than hope now felt authorized to lay down weapons. The surrender process was chaotic and piecemeal. There was no formal ceremony, no single moment when the Sixth Army ceased to exist. Instead, individual units surrendered independently across the pocket over 3 days. Some units received orders to surrender from their immediate commanders. Others fought until ammunition was exhausted, then raised white flags. Still others retreated toward the Volga, hoping to find boats that no longer existed, and surrendered when they reached the frozen river. Soviet forces processed prisoners systematically but struggled with the volume. 91,000 prisoners exceeded Soviet planning assumptions. Collection points were established where German soldiers gathered, were disarmed, searched for intelligence documents, then marched east toward POW camps. The march began immediately, despite prisoners being barely able to walk. January 31st afternoon. Soviet interrogators meet with Paulus in his temporary captivity location. The senior interrogator, NKVD Colonel Mikhail Voronov, attempts to extract intelligence about German strategic planning, upcoming operations, command structure. Paulus provides basic information but refuses to discuss strategic matters, citing military ethics. The interrogation is professional, not brutal. Paulus is valuable propaganda asset to be treated carefully. Photographs are taken showing Paulus in Soviet custody, images that will be published worldwide demonstrating Germany's catastrophic defeat. The photos show a gaunt man, face haggard, eyes defeated, wearing his field marshal insignia in Soviet captivity. The images become iconic, symbolizing Wehrmacht's fall from invincibility to humiliation. February 1st. The southern pocket's organized resistance collapses. German soldiers emerge from cellars and ruins in thousands, hands raised, walking towards Soviet lines. Many collapse during the walk, too weak to complete the journey. Soviet soldiers, shocked by German prisoners' condition, describe them as walking skeletons and living corpses. A Soviet lieutenant's account: "We expected enemy soldiers. We found walking dead. Men who weighed perhaps 80 pounds, skin stretched over bones, eyes hollow, unable to speak coherently. Some died while surrendering, simply collapsed and didn't rise. Others begged for food with such desperation, it was disturbing. These were not soldiers, they were victims. Soviet command had prepared for prisoners, but not for prisoners in this condition. Medical facilities were overwhelmed, food supplies were inadequate. Many German soldiers who survived the battle would die in the first weeks of captivity from complications of starvation and disease. The northern pocket, under General Karl Strecker, continued fighting until February 2nd. Strecker commanded approximately 50,000 men defending the tractor factory district. When news of Paulus's surrender reached him, Strecker faced the same decision: obey Hitler's order to fight to the last, or accept reality and surrender. Strecker chose to fight another day, partially from obstinacy, partially from belief that continued resistance served some purpose. But his men were dying in the same horrific way as the southern pocket. On February 1st, Soviet forces launched final assault on the northern pocket, overwhelming exhausted defenders. Strecker surrendered February 2nd at 10 a.m. His final message to Hitler: 6th Army, under Field Marshal Paulus, and forces under my command, have fought to the last breath. Long live Germany. Hitler received the message coldly. He had wanted his commanders to die, not surrender. Their survival was betrayal in his eyes. The total prisoner count, 91,000 German and Axis troops, included 2,500 officers and 24 generals. These generals included divisional commanders, corps commanders, Paulus himself, and his senior staff. The capture of so many high-ranking officers was unprecedented. Soviet propagandists utilized this windfall immediately, photographing generals in captivity, publishing interviews where captured officers described battle conditions and Hitler's refusal to authorize withdrawal. Some generals, including Paulus eventually, participated in anti-Hitler propaganda efforts, joining the National Committee for a Free Germany, a Soviet-sponsored organization of German prisoners advocating Germany's surrender. Other generals refused all cooperation, maintaining loyalty to Nazi Germany despite captivity. The division among captured German leadership reflected broader questions about duty, loyalty, and complicity that would haunt survivors for decades. The final days of fighting in Stalingrad were characterized by profound suffering, transcending military categories. Soldiers on both sides were exhausted beyond human limits. Soviet troops, having fought for 5 months defending and then destroying the pocket, were physically and psychologically destroyed. German prisoners were beyond description. Medical officers examining prisoners recorded conditions that seemed impossible for living humans. Body weights reduced by 60 to 80 pounds, advanced starvation causing organ failure, typhus infection rates over 70%, frostbite requiring amputation in thousands of cases. That any men survived at all represented human resilience beyond normal limits. Most did not survive long. The march to POW camps killed thousands more. Camps themselves, unprepared for mass influx of prisoners, had inadequate facilities, food, and medical care. German POWs died by thousands in the first months of captivity. February 3, 1943. Soviet forces conduct victory ceremonies at Mamayev Kurgan. Red Army soldiers, bundled in winter coats, gather around a hastily erected flagpole where the red flag flies over ruins. Political officers make speeches about Soviet victory, Stalin's genius, the inevitable triumph of socialism over fascism. Soldiers listen with exhausted indifference. They are too tired for triumphalism, too traumatized by what they witnessed. A Soviet sergeant, Viktor Nekrasov, described the mood. "We won, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. We looked at the ruins, the frozen bodies, the devastation, and wondered what we had won exactly. The city was destroyed. 1 million people were dead. We had defeated the Germans, but at costs that seemed almost unbearable, and we knew the war would continue. Stalingrad was one battle. How many more would we fight before this ended?" His words captured the reality. Stalingrad was turning point, but the turning came at terrible cost and guaranteed nothing except that the dying would continue for 2 more years. The photographs taken of German prisoners in early February became some of World War II's most iconic and disturbing images. Columns of skeletal men shuffling through snow, faces aged beyond their years, eyes empty of hope. These images were published worldwide, shocking audiences in Allied and neutral countries. The images served Soviet propaganda purposes, demonstrating that invincible Wehrmacht could be defeated and destroyed. But the images also raised uncomfortable questions. How had civilized nations allowed warfare to devolve into this? What kind of leadership condemned men to such suffering? The photos of Stalingrad's prisoners became testaments to war's horror, enduring long after the battle's tactical details were forgotten. They remained as warnings about where ideology and ego could lead when unchecked by humanity and reason. The men in those photographs, German and Soviet, both had become symbols of warfare's ultimate futility: suffering without meaning, sacrifice without purpose, death without dignity. They were not heroes. They were victims of leaders who valued pride over lives, who chose symbolic victories over strategic wisdom, who condemned hundreds of thousands to die for terrain that mattered only because dictators said it mattered. And in their frozen faces and hollow eyes was the truest lesson of Stalingrad: that war reduces humans to animals, that suffering has limits, even if cruelty does not, and that the costs of ego-driven leadership are always paid in blood by those with no choice but to obey. February 4th, 1943. Dawn breaks over a collection point 15 miles east of Stalingrad, where approximately 8,000 German prisoners have spent the night in open air, temperatures hovering at -25 degrees Celsius. Obergefreiter Klaus Hartmann, 24 years old, sits huddled against other prisoners for warmth, watching men die around him. During the night, hundreds died from exposure, starvation complications, or simply gave up and stopped breathing. Their bodies are frozen solid now, stacked at the collection point's perimeter like cordwood. Soviet guards order the survivors to stand and begin marching. The destination is unclear, somewhere east, toward POW camps in the Soviet interior. Hartmann struggles to his feet, his frostbitten feet barely supporting his weight. Around him, thousands of skeletal men begin shuffling east through snow. Men collapse within minutes, unable to continue. Soviet guards shoot some stragglers, leave others to freeze. The column moves slowly, leaving a trail of bodies. Hartmann thinks about his mother in Dresden, about whether she knows he's alive, about whether he'll ever see Germany again. The march has begun. For 91,000 German prisoners, this march will determine who lives and who joins the hundreds of thousands already dead. The mortality rate will be catastrophic. Of the men shuffling east this morning, fewer than 6,000 will ever return home. The scale of the POW catastrophe is difficult to comprehend. 91,000 prisoners taken at Stalingrad represented the largest single mass capture of German forces in history to that point. Soviet logistics and planning, focused on defeating the Sixth Army militarily, had not adequately prepared for housing, feeding, and transporting such numbers. POW camps were scattered across the Soviet Union, from the Caucasus to Siberia, requiring prisoners to march or be transported hundreds or thousands of miles to reach them. The prisoners were already at death's edge, starved for months, weakened by typhus and dysentery, many with frostbite requiring amputation, all in various stages of physical and psychological collapse. The combination of prisoner condition and Soviet unpreparedness created conditions where death became more likely than survival. The initial marches from Stalingrad collection points killed prisoners wholesale. Men who had survived the battle died within days or weeks of surrender. Marches occurred in winter conditions, with temperatures reaching -30 to -40 Celsius. Prisoners wore whatever clothing they had, often summer uniforms supplemented with scavenged coats or blankets. Boots were inadequate, feet freezing as they walked. Rations during marches were minimal or non-existent, occasionally bread, more often nothing. Water was snow-melted in mouths. Guards, themselves exhausted from months of combat, showed limited mercy. Men who could not keep pace were shot or left to freeze. Soviet guards later reported that prisoners died at rates of 10 to 20% during the first marches. Corpses lined the routes, frozen in the positions they collapsed, markers of the death march. The POW camps prisoners eventually reached were catastrophically unprepared. Camp Beketovka, one of the largest camps receiving Stalingrad prisoners, was designed for perhaps 20,000 inmates. 45,000 arrived in February and March. Barracks were overcrowded, 3 or 4 men sharing spaces designed for one. Heating was inadequate wood stoves that couldn't warm barracks in Siberian winter. Sanitation was primitive latrines that froze solid, forcing prisoners to defecate wherever possible. Medical facilities were overwhelmed. Soviet military doctors had minimal supplies even for their own wounded soldiers, and German prisoners received whatever was left over, which was usually nothing. Typhus spread uncontrolled through camps. Dysentery was universal. Starvation continued. Camp rations were theoretically equivalent to Soviet civilian rations, but Soviet civilians were also starving in 1943. Daily rations in camps averaged 400 to 600 calories, 1/3 of minimum human requirements. Prisoners' bodies, already depleted by Stalingrad, continued consuming themselves. Spring and summer 1943 witnessed the highest death rates in POW camps. Men who survived winter died as temperatures warmed and diseases proliferated. Typhus mortality peaked in April and May. Dysentery killed thousands in summer. Tuberculosis, pneumonia, and other infections killed continuously. Medical records from camps show death rates of 300 to 500 men per day in the larger camps during peak mortality periods. The death rate among Stalingrad POWs in 1943 exceeded 70%. By year's end, perhaps 25,000 of the original 91,000 remained alive. The Soviet Union's treatment of German POWs violated Geneva Convention provisions, but Soviet justification was straightforward. Germany had not ratified the 1929 convention and had treated Soviet POWs barbarically. 3.3 million Soviet POWs died in German captivity during the war, deliberately starved, worked to death, or executed. Soviet treatment of German POWs, while brutal, was partially revenge and partially resource scarcity. The Soviet Union struggled to feed its own population and military. The work regimes in POW camps accelerated death. Prisoners who survived the initial mortality were assigned labor: mining, construction, forestry, agriculture. Work quotas were set without regard to prisoner condition. Men barely able to stand were forced to dig mines or cut timber. Those who failed to meet quotas had rations reduced, creating death spirals where weakness led to reduced food, leading to greater weakness. Some prisoners, particularly specialists, engineers, doctors, skilled craftsmen, received better treatment and had higher survival rates. Common soldiers and infantry received minimal consideration. German officers initially received slightly better treatment than enlisted men, but distinctions eroded as camps struggled with overcrowding and supply shortages. Rank meant little when everyone was starving. Psychological trauma among POW survivors was profound and lasting. Men who endured Stalingrad's battle and survived captivity carried scars that never fully healed. Many experienced survivors' guilt, wondering why they lived when comrades died. Some were haunted by decisions made during starvation, stealing food from dying comrades, failing to help others, committing small betrayals that seemed necessary for survival. Post-traumatic stress disorder, though not yet understood medically in the 1940s, affected thousands of survivors. Nightmares, flashbacks, inability to discuss experiences, emotional numbness, survivors' rage, all became common among returnees. Soviet captivity also created stigma. In post-war Germany, soldiers who surrendered at Stalingrad were sometimes viewed with suspicion or contempt by those who believed they should have fought to the death. The survivors faced impossible contradictions. They were condemned for surrendering by ideologues who had not experienced Stalingrad's horror, yet they had only survived because they surrendered when further resistance meant certain death. Repatriation of German POWs began slowly. The first major release came in 1950, when approximately 1,900 prisoners were repatriated as gestures of goodwill after German Democratic Republic formation. In 1953, after Stalin's death, 3,000 more were released. The final major repatriation occurred in 1955 through 1956, following West German Chancellor Konrad Adenauer's negotiations with Soviet leadership. Approximately 5,000 final survivors of Stalingrad returned to Germany during this period. These men had survived 13 years of captivity, outliving 85,000 of their comrades. They returned to a Germany divided, unrecognizable from the nation they had left. Many found their families destroyed, wives remarried, believing them dead, children who didn't remember them, homes destroyed in Allied bombing. Reintegration was difficult or impossible for many survivors. Testimony from survivors provides glimpses into captivity's horror. Hans Diebold, who survived as a POW until 1956, described Camp Beketovka in 1943. Men died every hour. We stacked bodies outside the barracks each morning. Special details carried them to mass graves, but in winter the ground was too frozen to dig, so bodies accumulated in piles. The smell when spring came was indescribable. We lived among the dead and dying. Some men went insane, screaming at night or becoming catatonic. Others simply lost the will to live and died within days. I survived by becoming emotionally dead myself, by not thinking about the future or the past, only surviving each day. I stopped feeling entirely. That numbness saved my life, but destroyed something in me that never returned. His testimony represents thousands of similar accounts, variations on themes of suffering, dehumanization, psychological destruction. The question of responsibility for POW deaths is complex and contested. Soviet treatment violated international law and human decency, but occurred in context of total war, where Soviet Union struggled to feed its own population and military. German treatment of Soviet POWs was deliberately genocidal, implementing plans to starve millions as part of broader Nazi racial ideology. Soviet treatment of German POWs was brutal neglect rather than deliberate extermination, though the distinction mattered little to men dying in camps. Some historians argue Soviet leadership bears full responsibility for POW mortality. Others contextualize it within broader war conditions and German precedents. The debate continues. What is undeniable is that 85,000 men who survived Stalingrad's battle died in Soviet captivity, adding to the battle's already horrific toll. Whether those deaths were inevitable given conditions, or preventable through different Soviet policies, or deserved as punishment for German war crimes, remains contested. The dead themselves offer no opinion. February 1956. The final transport of Stalingrad survivors arrives in Friedland Camp, West Germany. Approximately 200 men disembark from trains, blinking in daylight, stunned to be home after 13 years. Families wait behind fences, holding photographs of soldiers from 1942, searching aged faces for recognition. Klaus Hartmann, who began the POW march in February 1943, is among the returnees. He is 37 years old but looks 60. His hair is white, his face is deeply lined. He walks with a limp from poorly healed frostbite. His mother is there, now elderly, having waited 13 years, not knowing if her son lived. Their reunion is awkward, painful. She embraces a stranger who resembles her son. He stares at an old woman who resembles his mother. Between them is a chasm of experience that cannot be bridged. Hartmann survived Stalingrad, survived the Death March, survived 13 years in Soviet camps. But what survived is questionable. The young soldier who wrote letters home about German victory in 1942 is dead. The man who returned is something else, something damaged beyond repair. He represents 6,000 survivors of 91,000 prisoners, walking proof of Stalingrad's cost and war's capacity to destroy humans while leaving them technically alive.